Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight we're building in Minecraft while we talk about someone who thought they could rewrite reality itself. Grab a drink, get comfortable, and let's dive into this mess. Before we dive in, I just want to say a big thank you to everyone who's been watching, commenting, and supporting the channel. Your encouragement means the world to me. It truly makes all the difference. Our first story is about jokes that weren't really jokes at all. It starts innocent enough, the kind of dark humor couples share when they're comfortable. But when those jokes start naming names, mentioning hotels, and getting oddly specific, you have to wonder if someone's confessing without meaning to. And that's exactly what happened here. We'd been together for 3 years when the jokes started. Looking back, I should have caught on sooner, but honestly, dark humor was kind of our thing. We'd always had that slightly twisted sense of comedy where nothing was off limits. So when my partner started making jokes about cheating, I didn't think much of it at first. It was just another bit, another running gag between us. We'd be watching a movie and they'd comment about how easy it would be to sneak around. I'd roll my eyes, laugh it off, and we'd move on. It felt harmless, but then the jokes started getting weirdly specific, like uncomfortably specific. They'd mention hotel names, not just any hotels either, but specific ones across town. They'd talk about what time of day would be best to, hypothetically, meet up with someone without getting caught. Lunch breaks, apparently. Late evening on Thursdays. They even started naming a coworker. At first it was vague, just someone from the office. But eventually they were dropping this person's actual name into these so-called jokes. I remember sitting there one night while they laughed about how this coworker had texted them something funny and how, if we were having an affair, that would have been the perfect cover story. They said it with this grin like it was the funniest thing in the world. I tried to brush it off. I told myself I was being paranoid. This was just their humor evolving, getting more elaborate. Maybe they were testing new material or something. But there was this nagging feeling in the back of my mind that wouldn't go away. The jokes weren't funny anymore. They felt like confessions wrapped in laughter. Still, I didn't want to be that person. The one who couldn't take a joke, the one who turned everything into a relationship interrogation. So I stayed quiet and tried to ignore the pit forming in my stomach every time they brought it up. Then came game night. We had a few friends over, nothing fancy, just some board games and drinks. The vibe was relaxed, everyone was having a good time, and then my partner made another one of those jokes, something about how they'd been working late so much recently that I should probably start getting suspicious. They laughed. A couple people gave those awkward courtesy chuckles, but one of our friends, Sarah, didn't laugh at all. Her face went completely pale. She looked at me, then at my partner, then back at me. It was the kind of look that said she knew something I didn't. The game continued, but I couldn't focus. Sarah kept glancing at me with this pained expression, like she was having an internal battle about whether or not to say something. Eventually, she got up and went to the kitchen. I followed her, pretending I needed another drink. As soon as we were alone, she grabbed my arm and whispered that we needed to talk. The way she said it made my blood run cold. We stepped outside onto the back porch, and that's when she pulled out her phone. Her hands were shaking as she opened her messages. She told me she'd been keeping a secret for months, thinking it wasn't her place to get involved. But after hearing that joke tonight, she couldn't stay silent anymore. Then she showed me the screenshots, messages between her and my partner, dozens of them. My partner had been confiding in Sarah about an affair for the past 6 months. Not hypothetical. Not a joke. An actual, ongoing affair with that coworker they kept mentioning. The screenshots were brutal to read. My partner had been telling Sarah everything. How the affair started, where they'd meet up, how guilty they felt, but how they couldn't stop. They'd been using Sarah as some kind of emotional dumping ground, making her swear not to tell me because it would destroy everything. Sarah had kept the secret because my partner convinced her they were going to end it, that it was a mistake, that telling me would only cause unnecessary pain. But as the months went on and the affair continued, Sarah realized she'd been manipulated into being an accomplice. I felt like I'd been punched in the chest. Everything suddenly made sense. The specific hotels, the Thursday evenings, the co-worker's name, they weren't jokes. They were breadcrumbs. My partner had been dropping hints the entire time, either because they wanted to get caught or because the guilt was eating them alive and they needed to confess without actually confessing. Maybe they thought if they said it enough times as a joke, it would somehow make it less real. Or maybe they were testing me, seeing if I'd ever connect the dots. Sarah apologized over and over, saying she should have told me sooner. I told her it wasn't her fault. She'd been put in an impossible position. The person I needed to be angry at was inside, probably laughing at another joke, completely unaware that their entire charade was about to collapse. But that wasn't even the worst part. When I went back inside, my partner was mid-story, entertaining everyone with some elaborate tale about work drama. They looked so comfortable, so at ease, like they didn't have a care in the world. I stood there in the doorway, watching them lie so effortlessly to a room full of people, and something inside me just snapped. I walked over, interrupted their story, and told everyone the party was over. My partner looked confused, maybe even a little annoyed that I was cutting their moment short. Our friends awkwardly gathered their things and left. Sarah squeezed my hand on her way out. Once we were alone, I confronted them. I didn't ease into it. I didn't give them a chance to spin another story. I just said it outright. I know about the affair. I know about the coworker. I know about the hotels and the lunch breaks and the Thursday evenings. I know everything. The look on their face was pure panic. They immediately started backtracking, stammering, trying to figure out how I found out. Then they saw my phone on the table with Sarah's messages still open, and their expression shifted from panic to anger. They tried to turn it around on me, said I was invading their privacy by looking at screenshots, said Sarah had no right to show me those messages, said I was overreacting because it wasn't even real. It was just venting, just thoughts they were working through, not an actual affair. Can you believe that? Caught red-handed with months of evidence, and they still tried to gaslight me into thinking I was the problem. I didn't yell, I didn't cry, I just started packing. I grabbed a suitcase from the closet and started throwing clothes into it while they followed me around the apartment, still trying to explain it away. They said they were confused, that they loved me, that the other person meant nothing. They said the jokes were their way of processing guilt over something that barely even happened. When that didn't work, they switched tactics and said I was being cruel, that I wasn't even giving them a chance to explain properly. But here's the thing, there was nothing to explain. The screenshot said it all. If you've made it this far into the chaos, you're as addicted to Reddit drama as I am. Make sure to subscribe and tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's talk about what happened when I confronted them with those screenshots. They finally broke down and admitted it was real. All of it. The affair had been going on for 6 months, just like Sarah said. They'd been meeting up at those hotels during lunch breaks and after work. The coworker knew about me and didn't care. My partner had been living this double life, coming home to me every night like nothing was wrong, while spending their days with someone else. And the worst part? They said they didn't even know why they did it. No big relationship problems, no major fights, nothing that would explain it away. They just did it because they could. The remorse they showed felt performative. They weren't sorry they did it. They were sorry they got caught. There's a difference, and I could see it clearly in that moment. They kept saying they'd end it, that they'd cut off all contact with the coworker, that we could go to therapy and work through this. But I was already done. I'd watched them lie to my face for months. I'd listened to them turn their betrayal into punchlines. I'd seen how easily they manipulated Sarah into keeping their secret. What was there to work through? I finished packing and called a friend to pick me up. My partner begged me to stay, to at least sleep on it, to not make any rash decisions. But this wasn't rash. This was the clearest decision I'd made in months. I told them I'd come back for the rest of my stuff later and that they could sleep in the bed they made, literally and figuratively. I stayed with a friend that night and blocked my partner's number. They tried reaching out through social media, through mutual friends, even showed up at my work once trying to talk. But I was finished. The affair was real. The jokes weren't jokes, and the relationship I thought I had never actually existed. They'd been playing a character the whole time, and I'd been too trusting to see it. Looking back, I don't know if the jokes were a cry for help or just arrogance. Maybe they wanted me to figure it out so they wouldn't have to be the one to end things. Maybe they genuinely thought they were clever enough to hide it in plain sight. Either way, it doesn't matter anymore. What matters is I got out before wasting any more years on someone who thought love was something you could joke about while actively destroying it. But at least I discovered the truth myself. The next person had someone else do the framing for them. I didn't notice it at first. You know how sometimes you get that weird feeling that something's off, but you can't quite put your finger on it? That was me for about 2 weeks straight. My friends started responding to my texts with one-word answers. Group chats I used to be active in suddenly went silent the second I posted anything. I'd send a meme, total crickets. I'd ask about weekend plans, nothing. At first, I figured everyone was just busy. Life happens, right? People get stressed, they pull back a little. I didn't want to be that person who makes everything about them. But then, it started happening at work too. Colleagues who used to grab coffee with me were suddenly too swamped to chat. People avoided eye contact in the hallway. I'd walk into the break room and conversations would just stop. Not slow down, not shift topics naturally. They'd just freeze like I'd caught them mid-conspiracy. I started wondering if I'd done something wrong, if I'd somehow offended everyone without realizing it. I replayed every interaction in my head, every email I'd sent, every Slack message. Nothing stood out. I felt like I was losing my mind. Then my boss called me into her office. The tone in her email was ice cold, just a calendar invite with no context, which is never a good sign. I walked in and she had this look on her face like she was disappointed but also uncomfortable, like she didn't want to be having this conversation, but felt obligated. She slid a folder across the desk and said we needed to have a concerning conversation about my conduct. My heart dropped into my stomach. I had no idea what she was talking about. She opened the folder and pulled out printed screenshots, messages, apparently from me, sent to various people on our team. Except these weren't just unprofessional, they were vile. I'm talking trash talking everyone on the team by name, calling them incompetent, lazy, backstabbers. There were messages to a friend where I apparently ripped apart our clients, used slurs I would never even think, let alone type. One screenshot showed me calling a client a racist and ableist term that made my skin crawl just reading it. My boss looked at me like she didn't even know who I was anymore. I sat there staring at these screenshots, and my brain just couldn't process it. I kept saying, I didn't write this, I didn't send this isn't real. But she had printouts. Multiple people had forwarded them to her. They looked legitimate. The formatting was right, the profile pictures matched. Even the timestamps seemed plausible. My boss asked if I'd been hacked, if someone had accessed my accounts. I told her I didn't know, but I needed to see the actual messages because I knew for a fact I hadn't sent them. I pulled out my phone right there in her office and opened every conversation she'd referenced. Nothing. The messages didn't exist. I went into my Slack history, my text threads, my Instagram DMs, everywhere these screenshots supposedly came from. Not a single one of those conversations was in my actual message history. I showed her my phone, scrolling through everything. She looked confused but also skeptical, like maybe I'd just deleted them. I told her flat out if I deleted messages, there would be a gap in the timestamps or some kind of indication. These conversations never happened. Someone faked them. Here's where it gets absurd. My boss didn't outright accuse me of lying, but she also didn't just believe me. She said she'd need to investigate further, and that in the meantime I should probably keep a low profile. Keep a low profile, like I was the one who'd done something wrong. I left that meeting feeling like my entire reality had been dismantled. Someone was actively trying to destroy my reputation, my career, and they were doing it with surgical precision. I went home that night and couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about who would do this, who had the technical skill, the motive, and the access to pull off something this calculated. Then it hit me. A co-worker, let's call him Derek, had been unusually friendly lately. Too friendly. He'd been asking a lot of questions about my projects, my client relationships, even my personal life. A few weeks earlier, I'd been told I was being considered for a promotion to a senior role. Derek had applied for the same position. I didn't think much of it at the time because we'd always been cordial. But now it felt like every conversation we'd had was suddenly suspicious. I needed proof. I couldn't just go to HR and say I had a hunch. So I did what any rational person would do when their life is being dismantled by fake screenshots. I hired a digital forensics expert. Cost me a chunk of savings, but I didn't care. I sent them every screenshot my boss had given me, along with my actual message history and account information. I explained the situation and asked if they could trace where these images came from, if there was metadata, anything that could prove they were fabricated. It took about a week, but the forensics report came back and it was glorious. The expert found metadata embedded in the screenshots that showed they'd been edited using specific software, not just cropped or adjusted for brightness, fully manipulated. Text had been altered, entire conversations fabricated from scratch, then screenshotted to look authentic. Even better, the file creation timestamps showed when the fake images were made, and some of them had been created on a workday during office hours. The expert couldn't definitively say who made them, but they gave me enough technical evidence to prove the screenshots weren't real. Then came the breaking point. I went back through my work computer's shared drive and found something interesting. Derek had access to a design software subscription through the company, the exact same software the forensics expert identified in the metadata. I also remembered he'd asked to borrow my phone a few weeks back, said his was dead and he needed to check an email real quick. I'd handed it over without thinking twice. That's probably when he screenshotted my contact list, my message app layout, everything he needed to make the fakes look convincing. I took the forensic report straight to HR, along with my findings about Derek's access to the software and the timeline of when the fake screenshots started circulating. I also pointed out that I was up for the same promotion he wanted, which was motive enough. HR took it seriously this time. They launched an internal investigation, pulled his work computer, checked his software usage logs. Turns out he'd been sloppy. He'd created some of the fake images on his work laptop, saved them in a folder he thought was private. It found everything. Within 3 days, Derek was called into a meeting with HR and legal. I wasn't in the room, but I heard from someone later that he tried to deny it at first. Said the files must have been planted, or that someone else used his computer. But the evidence was overwhelming. The metadata, the timestamps, the fact that he'd sent the fake screenshots to multiple people from his personal email. He'd been building this narrative for weeks, carefully sending the images to different colleagues and even some of my friends outside of work, making sure everyone saw me as this toxic, hateful person. The goal was to tank my reputation so badly that even if I got the promotion, I'd be too radioactive to actually succeed in the role. HR terminated him on the spot, walked him out of the building that same day. I got an official apology, my name was cleared internally, and they sent out a company-wide email clarifying that false information had been circulated and that the matter had been resolved. You'd think that would be the end of it, that everyone would just move on and forget it happened. But that wasn't even the worst part. Some people still believed the fake screenshots. Even after HR's email, even after Derek was fired, there were colleagues who'd seen those images and couldn't shake the idea that maybe, just maybe, I'd actually said those things and had somehow weaseled my way out of consequences. A few of my friends outside of work stopped responding altogether. They didn't want drama, didn't want to pick sides, so they just quietly distanced themselves. It didn't matter that I had forensic proof, that the person responsible had been caught and fired. The damage was done. I got the promotion eventually. But it felt hollow. I'd walk into meetings and wonder who in the room had seen those screenshots, who still thought I was capable of saying those things. I became hyper-aware of every message I sent, every email I wrote, paranoid that someone might twist my words again. I started screenshotting my own conversations, keeping records of everything just in case. It's exhausting living like that, constantly looking over your shoulder, wondering who's waiting for you to slip up. The thing that still gets me is how easy it was for Derek to almost destroy my entire career. A little software, some free time, and a willingness to be absolutely ruthless. If I hadn't pushed back, if I hadn't spent the money on that forensic report, I'd probably be unemployed right now, blacklisted from my industry, with a reputation I could never recover from. And he would have gotten exactly what he wanted. You almost have to admire the audacity. Not in a respectful way, but in that horrified, can't look away kind of way. He really thought he'd get away with it. Thought he was clever enough to fake everything perfectly, to cover his tracks, to ruin someone's life and just step into their job like nothing happened. The arrogance is almost impressive. Almost. I still work at the same company, but things are different now. I keep my circle smaller. I don't share as much. I definitely don't hand my phone to anyone. Ever. And every time I send a message, there's this tiny voice in the back of my head, reminding me that words can be weaponized, even when you never said them. Speaking of people who mess with your professional life, wait until you hear what happened when someone's promotion became a trap. The announcement came during the quarterly all-hands meeting. Our CEO stood at the front of the room with this huge grin, and when he said my name, I genuinely thought I'd misheard him. Senior Director of Operations. It was the role I'd been working toward for 3 years. The room erupted in applause. People I barely knew were clapping. Someone popped champagne. My manager came over and shook my hand like we'd just closed some massive deal. I felt like I was floating. This was it. Everything I'd worked for, every late night, every weekend I'd sacrificed, it all led to this moment. They'd even prepared a whole slideshow about my contributions to the company. Metrics I'd improved, projects I'd spearheaded, client relationships I'd built from scratch. The CEO talked about how I embodied the company's values, how I was exactly the kind of leader they wanted shaping the future. I stood there in front of everyone, trying not to cry from sheer relief and pride. After the meeting, people lined up to congratulate me. I got texts from former colleagues, messages on LinkedIn. Even my parents called because someone had already posted about it online. It felt surreal in the best possible way. I signed the official paperwork the next day. Contract amendment, new salary, updated benefits package, the works. Everything was formalized. I even started transitioning some of my old responsibilities to my replacement. I met with my new team, started setting up one-on-ones, began mapping out my first 90 days in the role. I bought a new laptop bag because the one I had felt too junior for a senior director. I know that sounds ridiculous, but I wanted to look the part. I was ready. 3 days after the announcement, my manager sent me a calendar invite. No subject line, just a 30-minute block labeled Quick Sync with an HR representative included. My stomach dropped immediately. Nothing good ever comes from an unscheduled meeting with HR. I told myself I was being paranoid, that maybe it was just some standard onboarding thing for the new role, paperwork I'd forgotten to file. But I knew. Deep down, I knew something was wrong. I walked into the conference room and both of them had these practiced neutral expressions. You know the look, polite but distant, like they'd rehearsed this conversation multiple times before I arrived. My manager gestured for me to sit down. The HR rep, someone I'd never worked with directly, folded her hands on the table and started talking in that overly gentle tone people use when they're about to ruin your day. She said they needed to discuss some changes to my employment status. Changes, not updates, not adjustments, changes. Then she said it. Due to unexpected budget restructuring, they were rescinding the promotion offer. Rescinding. I sat there, the word bouncing around my skull like it didn't make sense. I asked her to repeat it because surely I'd misunderstood. She said it again, slower this time, like I was having trouble processing basic language. The promotion was being pulled. I'd be staying in my current role at my current salary. They apologized for any confusion. Any confusion. I'd signed a contract. I'd announced it to my family. People across the industry had seen the LinkedIn posts. I'd already started transitioning my workload, and they were calling it confusion. I pulled out my phone and opened the email with the signed contract attachment. I held it up and asked how they were legally allowed to rescind an offer I'd already accepted in writing. That's when the energy in the room shifted. My manager, who'd barely said a word up to that point, cleared his throat and said the situation was more complicated than it appeared. He used the phrase extenuating circumstances, which is corporate speak for we messed up and now we're scrambling. I asked him to explain exactly what circumstances would justify publicly promoting someone and then privately firing them 3 days later. He glanced at the HR rep. She glanced back. Neither of them wanted to say it, so I pushed harder. I told them I wasn't signing anything, wasn't agreeing to anything, until someone explained what was actually happening. The HR rep finally broke. She said the role had been verbally promised to someone else months before my promotion was announced. Someone else. Not a more qualified candidate, not someone who'd earned it through merit, just someone else who apparently had priority. I asked who. She wouldn't say. I asked why I was promoted if the role was already promised. She said it was a decision made above her level, and she was just there to facilitate the transition back to my old position. Facilitate the transition? Like I was a piece of furniture being moved to a different room. I could feel my face getting hot, that specific kind of anger that makes your hands shake. I asked if they understood how humiliating this was, how unprofessional, how borderline illegal. My manager actually had the audacity to say they hoped I'd handle this with discretion and maturity. Discretion. They wanted me to quietly accept being demoted after being publicly celebrated, and they wanted me to be mature about it. Here's where it gets absurd. I started asking more questions, refusing to let them steer the conversation back to their script. I asked about the budget restructuring they'd mentioned. When did that happen? Why wasn't it announced company-wide? If we were cutting costs, why was the role still being filled, just with someone else? The HR rep started stumbling over her answers. My manager looked like he wanted to be literally anywhere else. That's when I pieced it together. This wasn't about budget. This was about protecting someone. I asked point blank if the person who'd been promised the role was related to anyone in leadership. The silence that followed told me everything. My manager finally admitted that the CEO's nephew had been in discussions for the role, but he wasn't ready yet, wasn't qualified yet, and the board had pushed back on the nepotism. So they'd promoted me publicly to make it look like they were making decisions based on merit, hoping the board would approve the headcount. When the board found out about the nephew situation, they demanded transparency. The company panicked. They couldn't admit they'd tried to sneak in a family hire, so they decided to quietly undo my promotion and hope I'd go along with it. I was a pawn, a literal pawn in some internal political chess game between the CEO and the board. They'd used my career, my reputation, my genuine accomplishments as a smokescreen for nepotism, and when it backfired, their solution was to just erase me from the equation and hope nobody noticed. The HR rep slid a document across the table, a non-disclosure agreement. They were offering me 3-month severance if I agreed not to discuss the circumstances of the promotion being rescinded, not to disparage the company, and to resign quietly. 3 months. They thought they could buy my silence for 3 months of salary after destroying my credibility in front of the entire company and half my professional network. I looked at that NDA and I made a decision. I told them I wasn't signing it. I wasn't resigning. If they wanted me gone, they'd have to fire me officially, on record, with documentation. The HR rep's face went pale. She said that wouldn't be in my best interest. I told her my best interest stopped being their concern the second they decided to use me as a corporate shield. I stood up and walked out. That night I sat at my kitchen table staring at my laptop. I had the signed promotion acceptance letter. I had the email they'd sent 3 days later rescinding it. I had screenshots of the all-hands announcement, the champagne photo someone had posted, the congratulations messages. And I had a choice. I could take the severance, sign the NDA, and disappear quietly. Or I could burn it all down. I chose fire. I posted both documents side by side on LinkedIn, the acceptance letter and the termination letter, 3 days apart. I wrote a single paragraph explaining that I'd been promoted publicly and fired privately, that the role had been promised to a family member of leadership, and that I was sharing this because people deserve to know how the company actually operated behind closed doors. Then I hit post and closed my laptop. What happened next? Nobody saw it coming. The post went viral within hours. Current employees started commenting, some sharing their own stories of favoritism and internal corruption. Clients reached out asking what was going on. Industry publications picked it up. By the next morning, the company's stock had dipped, and 3 different news outlets were running stories about nepotism allegations. The board launched an internal investigation. The CEO, my former manager, and the head of HR were all put on administrative leave pending the outcome. I got calls from lawyers, from journalists, from recruiters at competing firms. The company's legal team sent a cease and desist, threatening to sue me for defamation. I forwarded it to an employment attorney who laughed and said they had no case. Everything I'd posted was factual and documented. A week later, the company reached out with a settlement offer. A real one this time. Enough to cover a year of salary, plus legal fees, plus a written apology and a neutral reference. I negotiated it up to 18 months and a clause that they couldn't retaliate or badmouth me in the industry. They agreed. I used that settlement to start my own consulting firm. Turns out being publicly screwed over by a major company makes you pretty attractive to their competitors. I had clients within a month. The CEO's nephew never did get that role, by the way. Last I heard, he's working in a completely different department, far away from any leadership position. The executives who tried to push the whole scheme through were quietly let go after the investigation. And me, I'm doing better than I ever was at that company. The whole thing taught me something important. When someone tries to use you as a shield, the best thing you can do is step aside and let everyone see what they're really hiding. They were counting on me staying quiet, on me valuing my career stability over my integrity. But the second they made me part of their lie, they gave me all the power. At least I fought back publicly. But some people don't realize they're being used until a dinner ruins everything. When our friends told us they wanted to throw a surprise fifth anniversary dinner, I was genuinely touched. My partner acted surprised too, like they had no idea it was coming, which I later realized was just another layer of the performance they'd been putting on for months. We got dressed up, headed to this nice Italian place downtown, the kind with dim lighting and candles on every table. I remember walking in and seeing all our closest friends already seated, cheering and clapping. It felt like one of those perfect moments you see in movies, the kind you want to freeze and remember forever. Except it wasn't perfect. I just didn't know that yet. The dinner started off normal enough. Everyone was chatting, ordering drinks, reminiscing about how my partner and I met. Our friends kept making toasts, saying how happy they were to see us still going strong. But something felt off. I couldn't quite pin it down at first. Just little things. The way people kept glancing at each other when they thought I wasn't looking. Forced smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. Conversations that seemed to die the second I joined them. I tried to shake it off, told myself I was being paranoid, that I was reading too much into normal social awkwardness. Then my partner's coworker showed up. She wasn't on the guest list. I didn't even know she knew about the dinner. She walked in already a few drinks deep, stumbling slightly, makeup smudged like she'd been crying. My partner's face drained of all color the second they saw her. I watched them mouth something that looked like, "What are you doing here?" across the room. She ignored them and made a beeline straight for our table. She threw her arms around both of us, this big sloppy hug that reeked of wine, and loudly congratulated us on our anniversary. Everyone at the table went stiff, the kind of tense silence where you can hear silverware clinking 3 tables over. She pulled back, looked directly at me with these glassy, unfocused eyes, and said, "I'm so glad you finally know, and you're working through it. It takes real strength to forgive and rebuild like you guys are doing." I froze. The entire restaurant could have collapsed around me, and I wouldn't have noticed. I just stood there, trying to process what she'd just said. Know what? Working through what? My brain was scrambling to make sense of it, running through every possible explanation that didn't involve the obvious. Maybe she had me confused with someone else. Maybe this was some weird inside joke I wasn't part of. Maybe I'd misheard her. But then I looked around the table. Every single person was staring at their plate, their drink, the wall, anywhere but at me. My partner had gone from pale to green, like they might actually be sick right there at the table. The coworker's smile started to fade as she realized something was very wrong. She looked at my partner, then back at me, and I watched the exact moment the alcohol fog cleared enough for her to understand what she'd just done. That's when everything unraveled. I turned to my partner and asked, point blank, what she was talking about. They tried to stammer out some explanation, something about a misunderstanding, but I cut them off. I looked at our friends, the people we'd known for years, and asked if someone wanted to tell me what I apparently already knew. The table was dead silent. Finally, one of my best friends, tears already streaming down her face, said she was so sorry. She thought I knew. They all thought I knew. My partner had been having an affair with someone from their office for over a year. Everyone at that table had known about it except me. But here's the part that really twists the knife. They didn't tell me because my partner had convinced them that I already found out months ago. My partner had apparently sat each of them down individually, fed them this whole story about how I'd discovered the affair, how devastated I was, but how we decided to work through it. They said we were going to therapy, doing the work, rebuilding trust. They even made up details about our sessions, things our therapist supposedly said, breakthroughs we'd allegedly had. Our friends believed it because why wouldn't they? They had no reason to think my partner would lie about something that elaborate. So when they saw us together acting normal, they assumed we really were working on things. The awkward glances, the forced smiles, it was all them trying to be supportive while not bringing up the painful topic I was supposedly trying to move past. They were walking on eggshells around a situation I didn't even know existed. The co-worker, the one who drunkenly blew everything up. She was the affair partner's friend. She'd been watching my partner play happy couple with me while still sneaking around with her friend, and it had been eating at her. She showed up to the dinner specifically to cause a scene, to force the truth out because she couldn't stand watching the lie continue. In her drunk logic, she thought I already knew about the affair, but not that it was still ongoing. She thought she was exposing the fact that my partner was still cheating, not revealing the entire affair from scratch. Here's where it gets absurd. My partner tried to do damage control right there in the middle of the restaurant. They stood up, tried to take my hand, started this whole speech about how they were going to tell me, how they'd been planning to come clean, how the affair had ended months ago. Except the coworker immediately called that out as another lie. She had screenshots, recent ones, messages from 2 days ago. My partner was still actively seeing this person, still lying to everyone, including the affair partner, about whether they were going to leave me. I didn't yell, I didn't cry, I didn't make a scene. I just stood up, looked at my partner and said, "We're done." 3 words. That's all it took to end a 5-year relationship. I walked out of that restaurant while my partner was still mid-sentence, trying to explain their way out of the unexplainable. I heard chairs scraping behind me as friends jumped up to follow, calling my name, but I just kept walking. They caught up to me in the parking lot, all of them apologizing, talking over each other, trying to explain why they didn't tell me. They thought I knew. They thought they were respecting my privacy by not bringing it up. They were so sorry. They should have said something. If they'd known I was completely in the dark, they would have told me immediately. I wanted to be angry at them. Part of me was, but the logical part of my brain understood they'd been manipulated too. My partner had weaponized their trust and concern, turned it into a tool to keep everyone complicit in the lie. The friend who'd cried at the table, she told me she'd almost said something dozens of times over the past few months. Every time we hung out, every casual coffee date, she'd wrestled with whether to bring it up. But my partner had been so convincing about us being in therapy, working through it privately, that she didn't want to interfere or make things harder by forcing me to relive it. She thought silence was support. They all did. I drove home that night, walked into the apartment I shared with my partner, and started packing. They came home an hour later, still trying to salvage something from the wreckage. They cried. They begged. They said the affair meant nothing, that they loved me, that they'd been too scared to tell the truth, that the lies just spiraled out of control. They admitted they'd told our friends I knew because they were terrified someone would tell me if they thought it was still a secret. By making everyone believe I already knew, they'd ensured no one would be the one to break the news. It was actually brilliant in the most twisted way possible. They'd created a situation where the truth was an open secret everyone was trying to politely avoid, which meant I was the only person living in blissful ignorance. And it would have kept working if that coworker hadn't gotten drunk and guilty enough to show up at our anniversary dinner. I told my partner to sleep somewhere else that night. They left. I sat in our apartment surrounded by half-packed boxes and just tried to process the scope of the betrayal. It wasn't just the affair, it was the systematic lying to everyone we knew, the fake therapy sessions, the manufactured narrative of reconciliation, the fact that for months, every time I'd interacted with our friends, I'd been performing in a play I didn't know I was in. The divorce was finalized 3 months later. My partner tried to contest it, wanted to fight for the relationship, but I was done. There was nothing left to fight for. The person I thought I'd married didn't exist. They were just a character my partner had been playing, and apparently not even consistently, given they'd been playing a different character for the affair partner, and yet another version for our friends. The humiliation of being the only one in the dark still messes with me. I'll be at a party or a work event, and I'll catch myself wondering what conversations are happening that I'm not part of, what everyone knows except me. I've gotten better at trusting people again, but there's always that small voice asking what I'm missing, what's being carefully not mentioned in my presence. Our mutual friends tried to stay neutral at first, but most of them eventually drifted toward me once they realized the full extent of the manipulation. A few stuck with my ex, said everyone makes mistakes, that the affair was bad, but the lying was understandable given the circumstances. I cut those people out. If you can justify that level of deception, we're operating with different moral compasses. The coworker who exposed everything sent me a message a few weeks later, apologizing for how it went down. She said she should have told me privately, not caused a scene at a public dinner. I told her I wasn't mad. If anything, I was grateful. Without her drunken confession, I might still be living that lie, showing up to friend gatherings while everyone tiptoed around the truth they thought I was bravely facing. 5 years together, 1 year of active cheating, months of elaborate cover stories, all of it destroyed in one dinner. And somehow the anniversary surprise our friends planned to celebrate our relationship ended up being the night it died. There's probably some irony in that, but mostly it just hurts. Betrayal from coworkers is brutal, but wait until you see what happens when family turns your home into a battlefield. My younger sibling called me in tears one night, saying they'd just gone through a brutal breakup and had nowhere to go. Their ex had kicked them out of the apartment they shared, and they needed a place to crash while they figured things out. I didn't even hesitate. I told them to pack whatever they could and come stay in my guest room. No rent, no timeline, just family helping family. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought a few months would give them enough time to heal, save up, and get back on their feet. I had no idea I was opening the door to a nightmare that would end with me having to legally evict my own blood. The first couple months were fine. They were genuinely going through it, spending a lot of time in their room, crying, processing the breakup. I gave them space. I'd check in occasionally, make sure they were eating, offer to talk if they needed it. They said they were applying for jobs, looking at apartments, doing all the things you're supposed to do when you're rebuilding your life. I believed them. Why wouldn't I? They're my sibling. I wanted to support them through one of the hardest times in their life. Then a few months turned into 6 months. Then 6 months turned into a year. They still weren't working. They weren't contributing to groceries, utilities, nothing. I'd come home to a mess in the kitchen, their laundry piled up in the bathroom, my streaming accounts logged in on multiple devices running up the bandwidth. When I'd gently bring up the idea of them maybe chipping in for household expenses, they'd get defensive. They'd say they were still recovering emotionally, that I didn't understand how hard the breakup had been, that they just needed a little more time, and like an idiot, I kept giving it to them. I started noticing other things too. They'd have friends over when I was at work, treating my place like their personal hangout spot. I'd find empty bottles, food wrappers, evidence that they'd been hosting people without even asking. One time I came home early, and there were 4 people I'd never met sitting in my living room, like it was the most natural thing in the world. My sibling introduced me casually, didn't even seem to think it was weird that they were throwing gatherings in someone else's house. I finally hit my limit. I sat them down and said as nicely as I could that it was time for them to start looking for their own place. I'd been more than patient, more than generous. But a year was long enough. They needed to stand on their own 2 feet. I expected pushback, maybe some guilt tripping. But what I got was way worse. They looked me dead in the eye and said no. Just flat out refused. Said they weren't going anywhere. I laughed at first because I thought they were joking. They weren't joking. They told me they'd been living there over a year, which meant they had tenant rights. They said I couldn't just kick them out without proper notice, that I'd have to go through the whole eviction process if I wanted them gone. I was stunned. This was my house, my name on the mortgage, my money paying for everything, and they were sitting there telling me I couldn't ask them to leave. The audacity was breathtaking, but that wasn't even the worst part. I started asking around, trying to figure out what my legal options were. That's when a neighbor mentioned something strange. They said my sibling had been telling people in the neighborhood that they owned the house. Not that they were staying with me, not that it was my place. They'd been saying the house was theirs, and I was the one living with them. I thought the neighbor must have misunderstood, but then another neighbor confirmed the same thing. My sibling had been spreading this story for months, apparently. I was furious. I confronted them about it, and they didn't even deny it. They shrugged and said people just assumed, and they didn't bother correcting anyone. I told them that was insane, that lying about owning my house was way over the line. They rolled their eyes like I was being dramatic. That's when I knew something else was going on. This wasn't just about being a freeloader anymore. This was calculated. I decided to check the county records, just to be safe. I don't even know what made me think to do it, maybe just paranoia. But I logged into the county assessor's website and pulled up my property information. And there it was, a quitclaim deed filed 3 months earlier, transferring ownership of my house from me to my sibling. My signature was on the document, except I'd never signed anything. I'd never even seen this paperwork before. They'd forged my signature and filed fraudulent documents with the county, trying to legally steal my house out from under me. I genuinely thought this couldn't get worse. I was wrong. I immediately called a real estate attorney, explained the situation, and sent over all the documentation. The attorney confirmed what I already knew. The deed was fraudulent. My sibling had forged my signature, notarized it somehow, probably with a fake ID or a crooked notary, and submitted it to the county. The goal was clear. If they could establish themselves as the legal owner on paper, combined with the fact that they'd been living there over a year, they thought they could claim the house was theirs. They actually believed they could just take my home, and there was nothing I could do about it. The attorney filed an emergency motion to void the fraudulent deed. We had to prove my signature was forged, which meant getting a handwriting expert involved, submitting notarized affidavits, the whole legal circus. It took weeks, but eventually the court voided the deed and restored my name as the sole owner. My siblings' little scheme fell apart completely. But here's the thing, even with the deed voided, they still wouldn't leave. They dug in, claiming squatters' rights, tenant protections, whatever they could think of to stay in my house. I had no choice. I had to formally evict my own sibling. I filed the paperwork, served them notice, went through the entire humiliating process of dragging a family member through housing court. They fought it, of course, showed up with some bargain bin lawyer who tried to argue they'd established residency, and I was retaliating against them for asserting their rights. The judge wasn't having it. The eviction was granted. They had 30 days to get out. During those 30 days, they went scorched earth. They called our parents crying, saying I was kicking them out of their home, that I'd turned on them when they needed me most. They painted themselves as the victim, said I'd become cruel and heartless, that I was abandoning family over a petty dispute. Our parents called me, confused and upset, demanding to know why I was doing this. They'd only heard my siblings' version, which apparently involved zero mention of the forged deed, the refusal to leave, or the year of freeloading. I didn't even argue. I just sent our parents copies of everything. The fraudulent quitclaim deed with the forged signature, the court documents voiding it, the eviction notice, the police report I'd filed for fraud. I laid it all out in one email and said if they wanted to hear my side, there it was in black and white. Our parents went completely silent. No calls, no texts, nothing. I think they were in shock. Their golden child had tried to commit literal real estate fraud against their other kid, and they didn't know how to process it. My sibling finally moved out on day 29, one day before the sheriff would have forcibly removed them. They didn't say a word to me, just packed their stuff and left. No apology, no acknowledgement of what they'd done, nothing. They moved in with a friend, and I haven't heard from them since. Our parents reached out once, awkwardly, asking if we could all sit down and talk things through. I said no, there's nothing to talk through. My sibling tried to steal my house using forged documents and then played victim when they got caught. That's not a misunderstanding or a family squabble. That's criminal behavior. I changed all my locks, installed a security system, and made sure every single document related to my house was locked down tight. I check the county records every few months just to make sure nothing else has been filed in my name. I know that sounds paranoid, but after what happened, I don't trust anything anymore. The wildest part is my sibling still hasn't acknowledged what they did. From what I've heard through mutual acquaintances, they're still telling people I screwed them over, that I kicked them out for no reason. The delusion is unreal. Looking back, I can see all the red flags I missed. The entitlement, the manipulation, the way they slowly started acting like my house was theirs. It didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual takeover, piece by piece, until they genuinely believed they had a claim to it. And when I pushed back, they didn't just leave quietly. They tried to make it legal. They actually thought they could forge a deed, wait out a year, and the house would just become theirs. The plan was so brazen, it almost worked. I don't regret helping them when they needed it. I regret not setting boundaries sooner. I regret letting guilt and family obligation override my common sense. But most of all, I regret ever thinking they'd do the right thing when it mattered. Family isn't always who you think they are, and sometimes the people closest to you are the ones most willing to destroy you if it benefits them. Family isn't always who you think they are, and neither are the bosses who praise you to your face. For 2 years, my boss called me his right hand. Not in a casual way either. In meetings with executives, in performance reviews, in front of clients. He'd say things like, "This is the person who keeps this entire department running," or "I don't know what I'd do without this level of dedication." I genuinely believed we had a good working relationship. He gave me more responsibilities every few months, trusted me with high stakes projects, brought me into strategy sessions that were usually reserved for senior leadership. I thought I was being groomed for a promotion. Turns out I was being groomed for something else entirely. I'd been working on a new client acquisition strategy for months. Our department had been plateauing, bringing in the same types of clients, hitting the same revenue targets year after year. I saw an opportunity to pivot our approach, target a different market segment, and use data-driven outreach instead of the traditional cold calling methods we'd been relying on. I built the entire framework from scratch: market research, competitor analysis, projected ROI, implementation timelines, the works. It was probably the most comprehensive project I'd ever put together. When I finished the initial proposal, I was excited. This could genuinely change how our department operated. I knew it was good. My boss knew it was good too. He called me into his office one afternoon and said he wanted to review it before I presented it to the executive team. He said it was standard protocol, that he needed to make sure the messaging was tight and the numbers were airtight before we brought it upstairs. That made sense to me. He was the department head. Of course he'd want to vet it first. So I sent him everything: the full presentation deck, the supporting documents, the spreadsheets with all my projections and calculations. We had a meeting where I walked him through the strategy step by step. He asked great questions, seemed genuinely impressed, told me this was exactly the kind of innovative thinking the company needed. He said he'd give me feedback by the end of the week, and then we'd schedule time with the C-suite to present it together. I left that meeting feeling like I was finally going to get the recognition I deserved. A week went by, no feedback. I followed up twice and he said he was still reviewing it, that he wanted to make sure we got it perfect before moving forward. Then I got a calendar notification: executive strategy meeting. My boss was listed as the presenter. I wasn't even invited. I assumed it was a different project, maybe something he was working on separately. I didn't think much of it until I ran into someone from the executive team in the hallway the next day. They congratulated me, said they'd heard about the new client acquisition strategy and that it was a game changer. I smiled and thanked them, but inside I was confused. How did they know about it? We hadn't presented yet. Then they said something that made my stomach drop. They mentioned how impressed they were with my boss for developing such a comprehensive plan. My boss, not me. My boss. I went straight back to my desk and checked the company intranet. Sure enough, there was a summary of the executive meeting posted that morning. New strategic initiative approved. Department head presents innovative client acquisition model projected to triple revenue. There was a photo of my boss standing in front of a screen. My screen. My slides, my data, my entire strategy, presented as his own work. I sat there staring at my computer, trying to process what had just happened. He hadn't just taken credit for my work. He deliberately excluded me from the presentation, told the executives he'd developed it, and was now being celebrated as some kind of visionary leader. I felt sick. I pulled up the original files I'd sent him, checked the timestamps, made sure I had proof that I'd created everything. Then I walked to his office. He was on the phone when I got there, but he saw me through the glass and waved me in with this big smile like nothing was wrong. He wrapped up his call and immediately started talking about how well the presentation had gone, how excited the executives were, how this was going to transform our department. He said all of this like I should be thrilled for him, like I was supposed to celebrate while he stole my work. I asked him directly, why wasn't I in that meeting? Why didn't you mention that I developed the strategy? His expression shifted. The friendly mask slipped for just a second, and I saw something cold underneath. Then he leaned back in his chair and said, I needed to understand how these things work. He said executives don't want to hear ideas from someone at my level. They want to hear them from leadership. He told me I was too junior for the C-suite to take seriously, that if he'd brought me into that room and said this was my idea, they would have picked it apart looking for holes. Then he said the part that really made my blood boil. He told me he'd done me a favor. By presenting the strategy himself, he'd given my ideas credibility. He'd made sure they got approved instead of dismissed. And now that the strategy was moving forward, I'd get to be part of the implementation team. He made it sound like I should be grateful, like he'd sacrificed his own time and energy to save my fragile little ideas from being rejected. I asked him about the promotion and bonus I'd heard he was getting as a result of the presentation. He didn't even flinch. He said that came with the territory of being a department head, that leadership gets rewarded for successful initiatives. Then he told me if I kept working hard and being a team player, my time would come eventually. A team player, that's what he called it. Being a team player apparently meant letting your boss steal your work and smile while he did it. Here's where it gets absurd. He actually tried to spin it like this was a mentorship moment. He said one day when I moved up the ranks, I'd understand that leadership isn't about individual recognition. It's about driving results for the team. He was teaching me an important lesson about corporate dynamics. I sat there listening to him gaslight me in real time, wrapping theft in the language of professional development. I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I just nodded and said I understood. Then I went back to my desk and started documenting everything. I pulled every email I'd sent him about the project. I downloaded every draft with visible timestamps showing when I'd created them. I exported Slack messages where I'd discussed the strategy with colleagues before ever showing it to him. I grabbed screenshots of the meeting notes where I'd walked him through the presentation. I even found an email thread where I'd asked a coworker for feedback on the market research, dated 2 months before his executive pitch. I compiled everything into a single PDF, chronological order, annotated with context, impossible to misinterpret. Then I wrote a letter, not to my boss, to the CEO. I explained exactly what had happened. I attached the documentation. I also attached my resignation, effective in 2 weeks. I wasn't asking for anything. I wasn't demanding an investigation. I was simply stating facts and walking away with my integrity intact. I sent it on a Friday afternoon and spent the weekend wondering if I'd just nuked my career. But Monday morning, I got called into a meeting with the CEO and the head of HR. They'd reviewed everything I'd sent. They'd also pulled the original files from the company server, which confirmed the timestamps I provided. They asked me to walk them through the timeline. I did. They asked if my boss had contributed anything to the strategy. I said he'd asked good questions during our review meeting, but the concept, research, and execution plan were entirely mine. They thanked me for bringing it to their attention. 2 days later, my boss was called into a meeting. I wasn't there, but word spreads fast in an office. He'd been confronted with the evidence. He tried to claim it was a collaborative effort, that he'd provided strategic direction and I'd handled the execution. But the documentation was too clear. There was no ambiguity about who'd created what. The CEO didn't fire him immediately, but he was removed from the executive strategy team and his bonus was revoked. A month later, he was quietly demoted to a lateral position in a different department with no direct reports. That's when things took an unexpected turn. The CEO called me back in and offered me my boss's old job, department head, the promotion I'd been working toward for years, the one I thought I'd never get because I was too junior. They said they wanted leadership that actually valued their team's contributions, that the company needed people with integrity in senior positions. The offer was generous, better title, significant raise, real influence over department strategy. I thanked them, and then I declined. I'd already accepted a position at a competing firm, better pay than what they were offering, better culture, and a leadership team that had specifically recruited me because they'd heard through industry contacts about the client acquisition strategy I'd developed. Turns out one of the executives at my old company had mentioned it to a colleague at another firm, and that colleague had reached out to me directly. They wanted someone who could build innovative strategies. They didn't want someone who'd steal credit for them. Before I left, I made sure everyone knew the truth, not in a vindictive way, just in a factual one. When colleagues asked where I was going and why, I told them. I'd developed a strategy that tripled our projected revenue, and my boss had presented it as his own work. The CEO had confirmed this after reviewing the documentation. I was moving somewhere that valued original thinking. The story spread through the office like wildfire. My last day was surreal. People I barely knew stopped by to congratulate me on the new job and to say they'd always suspected my old boss was taking credit for other people's work. Apparently, I wasn't the first person he'd done this to, just the first one who'd had enough documentation to prove it. Several people told me they wished they'd spoken up sooner. I ran into my former boss in the parking lot on my way out. He didn't say anything, just gave me this look like I'd betrayed him, like I was the one who'd broken some unspoken rule. I almost laughed. He genuinely believed he was the victim in this situation, that I'd been disloyal by not letting him continue stealing my work. The delusion was almost impressive. The new job has been everything I hoped for. I've implemented versions of that client acquisition strategy, and it's working even better than I'd projected. My current boss gives credit where it's due, amplifies my work instead of taking it, and actually mentors me instead of using mentorship as an excuse for exploitation. I didn't need my old company to give me the promotion. I just needed them to show me it was time to leave. That's corporate theft in action. But imagine when your own family invents an emergency just to drain your bank account. I got the call on a Tuesday night. My aunt, hysterical, barely able to get words out between sobs. She said my cousin had been in a car accident, serious injuries, internal bleeding. They needed emergency surgery, but the insurance company was denying coverage for some procedural reason, something about the hospital being out of network. She said they needed $8,000 immediately or the hospital wouldn't operate. $8,000 to save my cousin's life. I didn't hesitate. I didn't even think about it. This was family. You don't ask questions when someone's life is on the line. I told my aunt to send me the hospital information and I'd wire the money first thing in the morning. She thanked me over and over, crying so hard I could barely understand her. She kept saying I was saving her child's life, that she'd never forget this, that she'd pay me back as soon as the insurance sorted itself out. I told her not to worry about it, that family comes first, that we'd figure out the money later. I went to the bank the next morning and emptied my savings account. $8,000. That was everything I'd been putting away for the past 2 years. My emergency fund, my safety net, my plan to eventually put a down payment on a place of my own, gone in one wire transfer. But I didn't care. Money can be earned back. You can't replace a family member. I sent confirmation to my aunt and she called me immediately, still crying, saying the hospital had confirmed receipt and they were prepping my cousin for surgery. She promised to keep me updated. For the next 2 weeks, I got sporadic updates. The surgery went well. My cousin was in recovery. They were being discharged soon. Every update was vague, but I figured my aunt was just overwhelmed and didn't want to bog me down with medical details. I sent care package ideas, offered to visit once my cousin was feeling up to it. My aunt said they needed rest and quiet, that she'd let me know when visitors were okay. I respected that. I'd just handed over $8,000. The least I could do was give them space to heal. Then I was scrolling Instagram one night, just mindlessly going through stories, and I saw it. My cousin, in Cancun, posted 6 hours ago. No hospital gown, no casts, no bandages, nothing. Just them on a beach with a drink in each hand. Captioned, "Finally getting that vacation we deserved," with a bunch of party emojis. There were multiple photos, jet skis, sunset dinners, club photos with bottle service. They looked perfectly healthy. Better than healthy, actually. They looked like someone who just won the lottery and decided to blow it all in one trip. I sat there staring at my phone, trying to make it make sense. Maybe this was an old photo they just posted? But no. The timestamp was recent and the other people in the photos were tagging the location as current. Maybe it was a different cousin. Except I only had one cousin on that side of the family. Maybe they'd recovered impossibly fast and the doctor cleared them for international travel 2 weeks post-surgery. Even as I thought it, I knew how ridiculous that sounded. I called my aunt. No answer. I called again. Straight to voicemail. I sent a text asking how my cousin was recovering and if they were still resting at home. No response. I waited an hour, then called from a different number. She picked up on the second ring. I didn't ease into it. I asked her point blank if my cousin was in Cancun right now. The silence on the other end told me everything. Then she started crying again, but this time it sounded different. Not panicked desperation, just regular guilt. She said she was so sorry, that she never wanted to lie to me, that she felt terrible. I asked her to explain what exactly she was apologizing for, because I needed to hear her say it. That's when everything unraveled. There was no car accident, no surgery, no insurance denial. My cousin had been pressuring her for weeks to ask me for money, because they wanted to take a vacation and knew I'd never just hand over $8,000 for a trip, but they also knew I'd never refuse a medical emergency. So they came up with the story together. The car accident, the life-threatening injuries, the urgent surgery, all of it was fabricated specifically because they knew I'd immediately wire the money without asking too many questions. My aunt kept saying she was sorry, that my cousin had convinced her it would be fine, that they'd pay me back eventually so it wasn't really stealing. I asked her how lying about a medical emergency to steal someone's entire savings wasn't really stealing. She didn't have an answer for that. She just kept crying and saying she knew it was wrong, but my cousin had been so insistent, and she didn't want to cause family drama by refusing to help. 'Cause family drama. Like draining my bank account under false pretenses wasn't drama. Like lying to my face for 2 weeks while they partied in Mexico wasn't drama. The sheer audacity of that statement made me want to throw my phone across the room. I told her I wanted the money back immediately. She said they'd already spent most of it on the trip, but they'd pay me back in installments. I asked what kind of installment plan she had in mind. She said maybe $200 a month. 200. At that rate, it would take over 3 years to get my money back, and that's assuming they actually stuck to the payments, which based on their track record of honesty seemed unlikely. I told her that wasn't acceptable. I wanted a lump sum, and I wanted it within 30 days. She started crying harder, saying they didn't have that kind of money, that I was being unreasonable, that family should be understanding. I said family should also not commit fraud. She hung up on me. I gave them a week to come up with a repayment plan that wasn't insulting. They ignored my calls and messages. My cousin blocked me on social media. My aunt sent one text saying I was making this harder than it needed to be and that they'd pay me back when they could. But I needed to be patient and stop harassing them. Harassing them. I'd been defrauded out of $8,000 and asking for it back was harassment. Things went from bad to unhinged. I filed a case in small claims court. The maximum I could claim was lower than what they owed me, but it was better than nothing. I had the wire transfer records, the text messages where my aunt admitted the whole thing was a lie, everything documented. They didn't even show up to the hearing. The judge ruled in my favor immediately and issued a judgment for the full amount I'd claimed. I thought that would be the end of it. I'd get my money back, they'd learn a lesson about consequences, and maybe eventually we could rebuild some kind of relationship. But that wasn't even the worst part. 2 months after the judgment, I got a notification that they'd filed for bankruptcy. Both of them. My aunt and my cousin. They'd apparently racked up a bunch of other debt, probably from more trips and shopping sprees, and decided bankruptcy was easier than actually paying anyone back. The bankruptcy filing meant my judgment was likely going to be discharged, along with all their other debts. I'd gone through the whole court process, won, and was still not getting my money back. I contacted a lawyer to see if there was anything I could do. He said because it was a civil judgment and not criminal fraud, it would probably get wiped in the bankruptcy unless I could prove it was obtained through malicious intent, which is a high bar to clear legally. He said I could try to fight it, but it would cost more in legal fees than I'd likely recover. So basically, they'd won. They got their vacation, faced no real consequences, and I was out $8,000 plus court costs plus the emotional damage of knowing my own family saw me as an ATM they could rob without repercussions. I cut them off completely, blocked numbers, blocked social media, told other family members not to pass along messages. My parents found out what happened, and their reaction was somehow worse than the theft itself. They said I was making a big deal over money, that family is more important than cash, that I should forgive and move on. They actually suggested I was in the wrong for taking them to court. I told my parents it wasn't about the money. It was about being lied to in the most manipulative way possible. It was about them thinking so little of me that they'd fake a medical emergency, let me panic about a family member dying, and then use that fear to steal from me. It was about the complete lack of remorse or accountability. It was about being seen as nothing more than a resource to exploit. My parents said I was being dramatic, that everyone makes mistakes, that holding grudges doesn't help anyone. I asked them if they'd be saying the same thing if someone had scammed them out of their savings. They said that was different. I asked how. They didn't answer. The thing that still gets me is how casual they were about it after getting caught. No real apology, no attempt to make it right, just annoyance that I was upset, like I was the problem for not quietly accepting being robbed. My cousin posted a few months later about cutting off toxic family members who only care about money. The comments were full of people supporting them, saying blood isn't everything, that they were brave for setting boundaries. I saw it because a mutual friend sent me a screenshot, horrified on my behalf. They'd rewritten the entire narrative. In their version, I was the villain. The greedy relative who couldn't let go of a loan, who dragged them to court over a misunderstanding, who valued money over family. They left out the part where they invented a medical emergency to commit fraud. Just small details, really. I haven't spoken to that entire side of the family in over a year. Some of them reached out at first, trying to mediate, saying both sides had valid points. I told them there weren't two sides. There was the side that lied and stole, and the side that got lied to and stolen from. They stopped reaching out after that. The $8,000 is gone. I've accepted that. I rebuilt my savings slowly, and I'm almost back to where I was before they cleaned me out. But the trust is gone too, and that's not coming back. I'm more careful now, more skeptical. When someone asks for help, there's always that voice in the back of my head asking what they're not telling me, what the real story is. I used to be the person who'd drop everything for family. Now I'm the person who asks for documentation. And honestly, I don't know which version of me I like less. Some people will lie about emergencies. Others will just sabotage you first, then report the crime. I started noticing small things going wrong at work. Nothing major at first, just annoying little inconveniences that I brushed off as bad luck or my own forgetfulness. Files I knew I'd saved would vanish from the shared drive. Emails I'd sent would disappear from my sent folder. Client calls I'd scheduled weeks in advance would suddenly get rescheduled without anyone telling me, and I'd look like an idiot showing up to meetings that had been moved. I kept thinking I was losing my mind, that maybe I was more stressed than I realized, and just not keeping track of things properly. Then the mistakes started getting bigger. A presentation I'd spent days preparing completely disappeared the morning I was supposed to present it. Gone. No trace of it anywhere. I had to scramble to recreate it from memory in front of the entire department, looking completely unprepared and unprofessional. A major client email chain where I'd negotiated terms for weeks just vanished from my inbox. When the client followed up asking why I'd gone silent, I had no record of our previous conversations. I looked flaky, unreliable, like I couldn't manage basic communication. I started keeping backup copies of everything, screenshots, forwards to my personal email, duplicate files saved in 3 different places. I felt paranoid doing it, like I was overreacting, but something in my gut told me this wasn't random. Someone was messing with me. I just didn't know who or why. Then I got called into HR and everything clicked into place. My manager and an HR representative were waiting for me in the conference room. They had this serious, uncomfortable energy that immediately put me on edge. The HR rep slid a folder across the table and said they needed to discuss a complaint that had been filed against me. A complaint. I opened the folder and my stomach dropped. My coworker, someone I'd worked alongside for 2 years, had filed a formal harassment complaint claiming I'd been sabotaging their work, deleting their files, and making their job impossible. They said I was retaliating against them for getting a promotion I'd wanted, that I was creating a hostile work environment, and that they feared for their professional reputation because of my behavior. I sat there reading this complaint, and it was like looking in a mirror. Every single thing they accused me of doing, someone had been doing to me. The deleted files, the missing emails, the rescheduled meetings. They'd taken everything that had been happening to me and flipped it, filing the complaint first so when I inevitably said something, it would look like I was the one retaliating. It was brilliant in the most twisted way possible. They'd preemptively framed me for exactly what they were doing. The HR rep asked for my response. I told them flat out that everything in that complaint was a lie, that if anything, I was the one being sabotaged. My manager looked skeptical. The HR rep took notes, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. Why would my coworker file a complaint if they were the one doing the sabotaging? It didn't make sense from their perspective, but that was the whole point. By reporting me first, my coworker had established themselves as the victim. Anything I said now would sound like defensive deflection. I asked for 24 hours to gather evidence. The HR rep said I had a week to submit a formal response to the complaint. I left that meeting feeling like the floor had dropped out from under me. If I couldn't prove what was really happening, my career was done. This complaint would sit in my file forever. I'd be labeled as someone who harasses coworkers. Even if I wasn't fired, I'd never get promoted, never be trusted with important projects, never recover professionally. I went home that night and pulled together everything I'd been documenting, screenshots of files that existed one day and vanished the next, with timestamps showing when they were created and when they disappeared. Emails I'd forwarded to my personal account that no longer existed in my work inbox. Calendar invitations that had been altered without my knowledge. I had weeks of evidence showing a clear pattern of sabotage, but I needed more. I needed something undeniable. Then I remembered a conversation from a few weeks earlier. My coworker had been in an oddly good mood one afternoon, almost giddy. They'd made a comment about teaching me a lesson for thinking I deserved that promotion more than them. At the time, I thought they were just being petty, talking trash, but they'd also mentioned deleting some of my files as a prank. I'd laughed it off, thought they were joking. Now I realized they'd been bragging, and I'd recorded it. Not intentionally, but I'd been on a call earlier that day and left my recording app running by accident. It had captured our entire conversation, including them admitting to deleting my files and messing with my calendar. I'd completely forgotten about it until that moment. I pulled up the audio file and listened to it 3 times, making sure it was clear, that there was no ambiguity. It was perfect. They'd confessed to everything. I spent the next 2 days compiling a response, 40 pages of documentation, screenshots with timestamps, email forwards, calendar histories, and right at the end, the audio recording with a full transcript. I highlighted the part where they admitted to sabotaging me, where they laughed about making my work life hell. I submitted it all to HR with a cover letter explaining that I believed my coworker had filed a false complaint to preemptively discredit me before I could report their behavior. HR took 3 days to review everything, 3 days of walking into work not knowing if I was about to be fired, if my entire career was going to implode because someone decided to destroy me for sport. Then I got called back into the conference room. This time, my coworker was there too. They looked confident, almost smug. They thought they'd won. The HR rep opened a different folder, much thicker than the first one. She looked at my coworker and asked if they'd like to explain why their complaint contained detailed allegations of behavior that, according to my documentation, had actually been perpetrated by them. My coworker's face went pale. They stammered something about misunderstandings, about how maybe we'd both been experiencing technical issues. The HR rep cut them off and played the audio recording. Listening to my coworker's voice admitting to deleting my files, bragging about sabotaging me, it was surreal. They sat there frozen, as their own words played back in that sterile conference room. When the recording ended, the HR rep asked if they had anything to say. They tried to claim it was taken out of context, that it was a joke, that I'd manipulated the audio somehow, but there was nothing they could say. The evidence was overwhelming. Their complaint was dismissed immediately. They were put on administrative leave pending a full investigation into falsifying reports and workplace sabotage. A week later, they were terminated. HR sent out a vague email about personnel changes, and just like that, they were gone. The HR rep pulled me aside afterward and apologized, said they should have taken my initial response more seriously, that they were sorry I'd had to go through this. But the apology felt empty. The fact that they'd almost believed the fake complaint, that I'd had to produce 40 pages of evidence and a literal confession just to prove I wasn't the problem, it made me lose all faith in the system. If I hadn't been paranoid enough to document everything, if I hadn't accidentally recorded that conversation, I would have been the one fired. My career would have been destroyed based on lies, and there would have been nothing I could do about it. I kept working at that company for a few more months, but it never felt the same. Every time I interacted with HR, every time I got called into a meeting, I wondered if someone else was building a case against me. I started documenting everything obsessively, keeping records of every conversation, every email, every interaction. It was exhausting. Eventually, I left for a different job, but the paranoia followed me. The thing that still messes with me is how close it came to working. My coworker's plan was almost perfect. Report me first, establish themselves as the victim, make anything I said look like retaliation. If they'd been just a little less arrogant, if they hadn't bragged about what they were doing, they would have gotten away with it. I'd be the one with a harassment complaint in my file, probably unemployed, definitely unemployable in that industry. And they'd still be there, probably pulling the same move on someone else. People talk about workplace drama like it's petty nonsense, office politics that don't really matter. But this wasn't drama. This was someone actively trying to end my career because they were jealous, because they could, because they thought they were smart enough to get away with it, and the system almost let them. That's what keeps me up at night. Not what happened, but how easily it could have gone the other way. I learned a hard lesson from all of this. Trust is a luxury you can't afford in professional settings. Document everything, keep receipts, assume that someone, somewhere, is waiting for you to slip up so they can use it against you. It's a cynical way to live, but it's also realistic. My coworker taught me that. They just didn't expect me to be paranoid enough to catch them at their own game. False reports can destroy you, but so can secrets that family makes without your knowledge. I came home 2 days early from a business trip. My flight had been moved up because the client meetings wrapped faster than expected, so I figured I'd surprise my spouse with an early return. I walked into our apartment quietly, planning to maybe order their favorite takeout, make it a nice, unexpected evening together. Instead, I walked into a conversation that made me realize I'd been living in a completely different reality than the one being planned for me. My spouse was on the phone in the kitchen, back turned to the door so they didn't hear me come in. I heard my mother-in-law's voice on speaker, which wasn't unusual. They talked frequently, but then I heard her say something about the contractor finishing the master bedroom renovation by next month, and how excited she was for us to see the house in person. I froze in the hallway. What house? My spouse responded saying they thought the timeline was reasonable and that they'd been looking into the transition plan for leaving their job. Leaving their job? I stood there feeling like I'd walked into someone else's life. My mother-in-law started talking about how perfect the neighborhood was, how the schools were top-rated, how we'd be so close to family. She said something about grandbabies and how she'd already researched the best preschools in the area. My spouse laughed and said, "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," but didn't disagree. Then my father-in-law's voice chimed in, talking about how my spouse would be perfect running the operations side of the family business, how it had always been the plan. The plan. They kept saying the plan like it was something everyone knew about, something settled and agreed upon, except I'd never heard about any of this. Not the house, not the job change, not the moving, not the kids, not any of it. I just stood there in my own hallway feeling like a stranger in my own life. I walked into the kitchen. My spouse's face went white when they saw me. The phone call went completely silent. I could hear my in-laws on the other end, nobody saying anything, just this horrible pause where everyone realized I'd heard something I wasn't supposed to. My spouse stammered something about me being home early. I ignored that. I looked directly at them and asked, "Were you planning to tell me about any of this?" They ended the call quickly. Some mumbled excuse to their parents about talking later. Then they tried to do damage control. They said they didn't want to stress me out while I was traveling so much for work. They said they were planning to bring it up eventually. They just hadn't found the right time. They said their parents had found this amazing opportunity, and they wanted to have all the details figured out before presenting it to me, so I wouldn't have to worry about the logistics. I asked what details exactly had been figured out without me. That's when it all came spilling out. My in-laws had purchased a house 3 streets away from where they lived. They'd been renovating it for the past 4 months. The plan was for us to move in once the work was finished. My spouse was expected to quit their job and join the family business, something their parents had apparently been grooming them for since before we even got married. They'd already mapped out which rooms would be the nursery and the playroom for the future kids they'd decided we were having. They'd researched school districts and pediatricians and even looked into which church we'd attend. Our entire future had been planned, discussed, decided, and set into motion. And I was never consulted once. I wasn't part of the conversation. I was just expected to show up and play my role in their vision. I told my spouse absolutely not. Not to the house, not to the job change, not to moving closer to their parents, none of it. They looked genuinely confused, like they couldn't understand why I wasn't thrilled about this generous gift their parents were giving us. I pointed out that a gift you can't refuse isn't a gift. It's a leash. This wasn't about helping us. This was about control. Their parents wanted us close so they could dictate how we lived, how we raised our hypothetical children, what jobs we had, what our daily lives looked like. My spouse said I was overreacting. They said their parents were just trying to help, that this was how their family operated, that I should be grateful for the support. I asked if they'd ever once considered what I wanted. If it had occurred to them that maybe I liked my job, liked where we lived, liked having independence from hovering in-laws. They got defensive, said I was being ungrateful and selfish. Then the calls started. My mother-in-law first, crying about how hurt she was that I didn't appreciate everything they were doing for us. She said they'd spent months planning this surprise, that the house was supposed to be this beautiful gift, and I'd ruined it by being negative. My father-in-law called next, much less emotional, much more direct. He said I was being controlling, that I was keeping his child from their family, that a good spouse would support their partner's relationship with their parents. Controlling. I was being called controlling because I didn't want my entire life planned without my input. The irony was suffocating. My spouse said I was ruining a generous gift, that their parents had put so much thought and money into this, that the least I could do was consider it. I said I'd be happy to consider things I was actually part of deciding, but this wasn't a discussion, this was a presentation of decisions already made. They'd bought a house, they'd planned a career change, they'd designed a life, all without asking me once if that's what I wanted. That's when everything unraveled. I told my spouse we needed couples therapy immediately, or I was done. Not as a threat, just as a fact. I couldn't stay in a relationship where major life decisions were made behind my back, and I was expected to just smile and go along with it. They agreed to therapy, probably thinking the therapist would tell me I was being unreasonable. The first session was brutal. My spouse explained the situation from their perspective. Their parents had found this incredible opportunity. They wanted to help us get ahead financially. They wanted to be close to family. Everything they described sounded reasonable in isolation. Then the therapist asked me how I'd found out about all of this. I explained I'd overheard a phone call. The therapist asked if my spouse had planned to discuss it with me before any decisions were finalized. My spouse hesitated, then admitted they'd probably have brought it up after we'd already started packing. They said it just seemed easier to present it as a done deal, rather than have a long, complicated conversation about possibilities. The therapist's face did this tiny shift that I recognized immediately. The, "oh, I see what's happening here" face. Over the next few sessions, the therapist walked us through what healthy decision-making in a marriage looks like. Spoiler alert, it doesn't involve one person's family planning the couple's entire future without the other person's knowledge or consent. The therapist pointed out that my in-laws had essentially made unilateral decisions about our housing, employment, family planning, and geographic location, and my spouse had participated in those conversations without once thinking to include me. The therapist asked my spouse how they'd feel if my family had bought us a house across the country, planned for me to take over my family's business, and expected them to quit their job and move without being consulted. My spouse said that would be completely different. The therapist asked how. They couldn't answer. Things went from bad to unhinged when my in-laws found out we were in therapy. They called it an attack on their family. They said I was poisoning their child against them. My mother-in-law sent me a long text about how I'd never understood their family's closeness, how I was too independent and cold, how I didn't value family the way they did. My father-in-law told my spouse that if they had to choose between me and the family, they should choose wisely. The audacity of that statement. They'd literally tried to commandeer our lives, and were now framing my resistance as me being the divisive one. My spouse finally started to see it. Not all at once, but gradually. The therapist helped them understand that love and control aren't the same thing, that their parents' behavior wasn't generous, it was invasive. That a partnership means making decisions together, not presenting your partner with fate's accomplice designed by your parents. We didn't move into the house. My spouse didn't quit their job. We stayed exactly where we were, living the life we'd actually built together. My in-laws were furious. They tried withholding contact, thinking it would force us to apologize and comply. It didn't. They tried guilt, saying they'd wasted money on the house, that we were ungrateful. My spouse finally stood up to them and said the house was their choice to buy without consulting us, and we weren't responsible for decisions we never agreed to. The house sat empty for a while before they eventually sold it. They still bring it up occasionally, how much money they lost, how it was supposed to be for us. I've stopped engaging with those conversations. My spouse handles their parents now, sets boundaries, pushes back when they overstep. We're still together. Therapy helped, a lot. But I made something very clear early on, and I've never wavered from it. My life isn't a group project. I'm not a supporting character in someone else's family narrative. Any major decision that affects both of us gets discussed with both of us. Period. No more plans made behind my back. No more surprises that involve changing everything about how we live. My spouse understands that now. It took almost losing the marriage for them to get it. But they get it. Their parents still don't. They still think I'm the problem, that I'm keeping their child from them, that I ruined their generous gift. Let them think that. I'd rather be the villain in their story than a puppet in mine. At least I found out before moving. Others only discover the truth when they refuse to be someone's scapegoat. I was working late one Thursday when my coworker burst into my cubicle, looking like they'd just witnessed a murder. Their face was completely drained of color, hands shaking, barely able to form coherent sentences. They said they'd made a mistake during the system migration we'd been running all week. A big mistake. They'd accidentally deleted an entire client database. Not just any database either. Our biggest client, the one that represented about 30% of our company's annual revenue. The kind of client you don't lose unless you want to see mass layoffs. I asked them how bad it was. They pulled up the server and showed me. Gone. Completely wiped. Thousands of records, years of customer data, transaction histories, everything. Just vanished because they'd clicked the wrong confirmation button during a routine transfer. They were on the verge of a full panic attack, saying their career was over, they'd be fired, blacklisted from the industry. They begged me to help them fix it before anyone noticed. Said they'd do anything, they just needed this to disappear. I should have said no. I should have told them to go to management immediately, own the mistake, and let IT handle the recovery through proper channels. But they were genuinely terrified, and I'd made my share of mistakes over the years. I knew what it felt like to be one wrong click away from disaster. So I said I'd help. We had until Monday morning before anyone would notice the database was missing. That gave us about 60 hours. I spent the next 12 hours straight recovering that data. Going through backup systems, rebuilding corrupted files, cross-referencing everything to make sure nothing was permanently lost. My coworker mostly just stood there watching, occasionally bringing me coffee, asking if there was anything they could do. I sent them home around 2 in the morning and told them I'd handle the rest. By 6 the next morning, I had everything restored. The database was back, fully functional, like nothing had ever happened. I sent my coworker an email with the recovery confirmation and told them to double-check everything Monday morning before the client accessed anything. They replied immediately thanking me, saying they owed me their career, that they'd never forget this. I told them to just be more careful going forward and that we'd never speak of it again. They agreed. As far as anyone else knew, the migration had gone perfectly. No errors, no problems, no late nights recovering deleted databases. 6 months went by. I'd completely forgotten about the incident. My coworker and I had a normal working relationship, collaborated on projects, grabbed lunch occasionally. Everything seemed fine. Then the company announced a routine audit of all major system changes from the past year. Standard procedure, just making sure everything was documented properly and no security protocols had been violated. I wasn't worried. I hadn't done anything wrong. But that wasn't even the worst part. The audit found discrepancies in the logs from that migration night. Timestamps that didn't line up, backup files that had been accessed outside normal procedures, recovery protocols that weren't properly documented. Nothing major, but enough to trigger questions. It started interviewing everyone who'd been involved in the migration. That included me and my coworker. I figured we'd both just explain there'd been a minor hiccup that we'd fixed immediately. No big deal. Except when my coworker was called in for their interview, they told a completely different story. They said I had caused the deletion, that I'd panicked and begged them for help, that they'd spent all night heroically fixing my mistake while I freaked out. And they had proof. The emails, the ones I'd sent with recovery updates throughout the night. Every message had come from my account, talking about restoring the database, fixing the corruption, completing the recovery. To someone reading those emails without context, it absolutely looked like I was the one who'd screwed up and my coworker had saved the day. They'd taken my attempt to help and weaponized it into evidence of my incompetence. I got called into a meeting with my manager and HR. They had printouts of the emails asking me to explain why I'd deleted a critical database and failed to report it through proper channels. I tried to tell them what actually happened, that my coworker had done the deletion and I'd helped recover it. They asked if I had any proof. I didn't. It had been 6 months. I hadn't kept any documentation because we'd agreed to never mention it again. My word against theirs, and they had emails. I was put on a performance improvement plan. Basically, a formal warning that I was one mistake away from termination. My manager said they were disappointed that I'd tried to cover up a serious error instead of reporting it immediately, that the lack of transparency was almost worse than the original mistake. I sat through that meeting feeling like I was in an alternate reality. I'd saved my coworker's career, and this was how they repaid me, by turning me into their scapegoat. For 2 weeks, I walked around the office under a cloud of suspicion. People looked at me differently. Conversations would stop when I entered a room. I'd gone from being a trusted team member to someone who couldn't be relied on, all because I'd helped someone who was panicking, and they decided to throw me under the bus when accountability came calling. Then I remembered something. Server logs. Every action on the system gets logged with user credentials and timestamps. The IT department would have records of exactly who initiated the deletion. I didn't have direct access to those logs, but I knew someone in IT who did. I explained the situation and asked if they could pull the records from that night. They were hesitant at first, said it was getting involved in a personnel issue, but eventually agreed because the truth mattered. The logs were damning, clear as day, my coworker's credentials initiating the database deletion. My credentials didn't appear until 2 hours later when I started the recovery process. Timestamps, user IDs, action types, everything documented automatically by the system. Undeniable proof of who did what and when. I requested a formal hearing before they finalized my performance improvement plan. I brought the server logs. I walked through the timeline minute by minute. My coworker had deleted the database at 8:15. I didn't even log into the system until 10:30. Every recovery action was stamped with my credentials because I was the one doing the recovery, not because I'd caused the problem. The emails they'd used as evidence against me were literally me giving them updates on fixing their mistake. The room went quiet. My manager asked my coworker if they had any explanation. They tried to say maybe they'd misremembered, that it had been a stressful night and perhaps they'd confused who did what. I cut them off. I said there was no confusion. They'd lied deliberately. They'd taken my help and turned it into a weapon because when the audit started asking questions, they needed someone to blame, and I was convenient. Here's where it gets absurd. My coworker actually tried to spin it like they'd been protecting the company. Said they'd been trying to minimize the appearance of negligence by making it look like an individual error rather than a systemic problem, like framing me for their mistake was somehow a noble sacrifice for the greater good. The mental gymnastics were almost impressive. They were fired that afternoon. Walked out of the building with a box of their desk belongings while I watched from the window. HR issued me a formal apology, removed the performance improvement plan from my record, and offered me additional professional development opportunities as a gesture of goodwill. My manager pulled me aside and said they should have trusted me from the start, that they were sorry for doubting my integrity, but the damage was done. I'd spent 2 weeks being treated like a screw-up, watched colleagues lose respect for me based on lies, had my professional reputation questioned because I'd tried to help someone in crisis. The apology didn't undo any of that. The reinstatement didn't rebuild the trust that had been broken, not my trust in the company, but the company's trust in me. I could see it in meetings, the slight hesitation before assigning me critical tasks, the double-checking that hadn't existed before. I started job hunting the next week, found a position at a competitor within a month. Better pay, better title, fresh start when nobody knew about the incident. I gave my 2 weeks' notice and my manager seemed genuinely surprised, asked if there was anything they could do to make me stay. I told them the opportunity was too good to pass up. Kept it professional, but the real reason was simpler. I couldn't work somewhere that had been so ready to believe the worst about me. The coworker reached out after they got fired, sent me a long message saying they were sorry, that they'd panicked when the audit started, that they never meant for things to go that far. They said they'd just been trying to protect themselves, and it spiraled out of control. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. They'd made a choice to sacrifice me instead of facing consequences for their own actions. The apology was 6 months too late and didn't come with any actual accountability. I learned something from that whole mess. Covering for someone's mistake doesn't create loyalty, it creates liability. The second things get uncomfortable, people will protect themselves first. And if helping them gives them ammunition to use against you later, they'll use it without hesitation. I don't regret helping with the recovery. The data needed to be restored regardless of whose fault it was. But I regret not documenting everything, not insisting we report it properly, not protecting myself while I was protecting them. My new job is better in almost every way, but I'm different now, more cautious, less willing to go out on a limb for coworkers I don't know extremely well. When someone asks for help with something that could blow back, I think twice. I weigh the risks. I keep receipts. It's cynical, maybe, but it's the lesson I bought with 2 weeks of professional humiliation and a destroyed working relationship. The person who replaced me at my old company reached out recently asking about the role. I told them the work was solid, but to watch their back. They asked what I meant. I said just that some people will smile while sharpening the knife. They seem confused. They'll figure it out eventually. Refusing to be a scapegoat saved my job, but sometimes staying silent costs you everything you've built. For years, I let things slide. Small things at first. My business partner would tell a client story in a meeting, and somehow they'd become the hero of the narrative, even though I'd been the one who closed the deal. They'd present ideas we'd brainstorm together as if they'd come up with them solo. They'd make dismissive little comments about my contributions, framing them as less strategic, more operational. Nothing egregious enough to call out without looking petty. Nothing worth creating conflict over when we were building something successful together. We'd started the company from nothing. Equal partners, equal stake, equal vision. Or at least, that's what I thought. We complemented each other well in the beginning. I handled client relationships, product development, the creative problem solving. They handled operations, finance, investor relations. It worked. The company grew. We went from a two-person operation running out of a shared apartment to a legitimate business with employees, office space, and actual revenue. I was proud of what we'd built. I thought we both were. But over time, the dynamic shifted. Subtle power plays that I convinced myself I was imagining. They'd schedule important meetings without telling me, then apologize and say it slipped their mind. They'd make decisions about company direction and present them as done deals, leaving me to either agree or look like I was being difficult. They cultivated relationships with our investors, taking them to dinners and golf outings while I focused on actually running the business. I told myself it was fine. We had different strengths. They were better at the schmoozing, the politics. I was better at the work. It balanced out, except it didn't balance out. It slowly tilted in their favor, while I kept my head down and told myself that keeping the peace was more important than my ego. I didn't want to be the person who created drama over credit or recognition. I wanted to focus on building something meaningful, so I stayed quiet. I let the small slights accumulate. I convinced myself that as long as the company succeeded, the specifics of who got credit for what didn't matter. That strategy worked right up until the moment it destroyed me. We had a board meeting scheduled, routine quarterly review. I walked in expecting the usual financial reports and strategic planning discussion. Instead, my partner stood up and announced they had a proposal for restructuring the company's ownership. They had a whole presentation prepared, slides, financial projections, legal documentation, the works. I sat there watching them explain how the company had reached a point where it needed clearer leadership hierarchy, more decisive decision-making, less operational redundancy. Then they got to the actual proposal. They wanted to restructure ownership so they'd hold 65% of the company, and I'd be reduced to a 35% stake with a shift to a salaried employee role. I'd still be involved, they assured the board, still contributing, just in a more focused operational capacity rather than strategic leadership. They made it sound reasonable, like they were doing me a favor by letting me focus on what I was good at, without the burden of executive decisions. I looked around the room. The board members, people I'd worked with for years, were nodding along. A few of them had clearly already been briefed on this proposal before the meeting. My partner had lined up support in advance. They had lawyers ready to execute the paperwork. They had investor backing. This wasn't a proposal. This was a coup. And I'd walked into it completely blind. They'd been planning this for over a year. That's what one of the board members let slip during the discussion. Over a year of quietly building a case for why they should have majority control. Why the company needed singular leadership. Why I was better suited for a lesser role. A year of meetings I wasn't invited to. Conversations I wasn't part of. Strategic positioning that happened entirely behind my back while I was busy actually running the company they were trying to take from me. I sat through the rest of that presentation in a state of numb shock. When my partner finished, they looked at me with this expression of concern, like they genuinely expected me to just accept this. The board chair asked if I had any questions. I had about a million questions, but the only thing I could manage to say was that I'd need to review the proposal with my lawyer before responding. My partner looked annoyed, like I was being unnecessarily difficult about something they'd already decided. The meeting ended. I went back to my office, closed the door, and tried to process what had just happened. The company I'd founded, that I'd poured years of my life into, was being stolen from me in broad daylight with legal paperwork and board approval. And it was happening because I'd spent years staying quiet, avoiding conflict, letting my partner position themselves as the indispensable leader while I did the actual work. Then I remembered something. I'd been documenting everything. Not because I thought I'd need it, but because I'm obsessive about records. Every contribution I'd made to major projects, every client I'd brought in, every product decision I'd driven. I had emails, meeting notes, financial records showing which revenue streams I'd developed. I had contracts with my signature on them, proving my role in deals my partner had later taken credit for. I had years of evidence showing exactly what I'd built and what they'd claimed to build. I called my lawyer that same day, explained the situation, sent over everything I'd been keeping. She reviewed it for 3 days and called me back with a plan. We were going to file a counter-proposal backed by documentation of my partner's financial mismanagement, breach of fiduciary duty, and systematic credit theft. Turns out, while they'd been busy positioning themselves as the strategic mastermind, they'd also been playing fast and loose with company finances in ways that violated our partnership agreement. Here's where it gets absurd. My partner had been using company funds for personal expenses, disguising them as business costs. Nothing massive enough to trigger alarms, just steady, low-level fraud. Luxury dinners, they claimed, were investor meetings, but were actually personal celebrations. Travel expenses for trips that had nothing to do with company business. Even some renovations to their home office that they'd billed to the company as workspace improvements. My lawyer found patterns in the financial records that made it clear this wasn't accidental mischaracterization. This was deliberate exploitation. We compiled everything into a comprehensive counterproposal. My contributions to the company documented and timestamped. Their financial improprieties laid out with receipts. A legal argument for why their restructuring proposal was actually an attempt to push out a co-founder after systematically undermining their role and credibility. We sent it to the board with a 48-hour deadline for response. The next board meeting was very different from the last one. My lawyer presented our case while my partner sat there looking like they'd been hit by a truck. The board members who'd been nodding along to the restructuring proposal suddenly had a lot of questions about the financial irregularities. The investors who'd supposedly backed my partner's plan started backpedaling, saying they'd been given incomplete information. My partner tried to defend themselves, but every explanation just made things worse. One board member, someone who'd been particularly supportive of the restructuring, actually apologized to me directly, said they'd been sold a narrative about me being a less engaged partner, more interested in operations than strategy, and they'd taken that at face value without questioning it. They'd never looked at the actual data showing who was driving revenue, who was maintaining client relationships, who was actually building the company while my partner played politics. The board voted. They rejected the restructuring proposal entirely. Then they asked what I wanted to do moving forward. I'd spent the past week thinking about that question. I could stay, try to repair the partnership, implement better oversight. But I'd lost all trust. I couldn't work alongside someone who'd spent a year plotting to steal my company. So I proposed a buyout. I'd purchase my partner's stake at fair market value. They'd exit completely, and I'd continue running the company as sole owner. My partner looked like they wanted to fight it, but they didn't have leverage anymore. The board had seen the evidence of financial mismanagement. The investors had lost confidence. Their carefully constructed narrative had collapsed. They agreed to the buyout. We negotiated terms. Within 3 months, I owned the company outright, and my former partner was gone. The whole experience taught me something I should have learned years earlier. Silence doesn't keep the peace. It just gives other people space to fill with their own version of events. I stayed quiet about credit theft, about dismissive comments, about being slowly edged out of my own company. I told myself I was being mature, avoiding drama, focusing on what mattered. Really, I was just making it easier for someone to take everything I'd built. If I'd spoken up earlier, if I'd pushed back on those small slights and subtle power grabs, maybe it never would have escalated to a hostile takeover attempt. Or maybe it would have happened anyway, but I would have been better prepared. Either way, years of keeping the peace almost cost me everything. Speaking up, finally fighting back, saved my company. I run things differently now. When someone tries to take credit that isn't theirs, I correct it immediately. When decisions get made without me, I make it clear that's not acceptable. When anyone tries to rewrite the narrative of who built what, I point to the receipts. It's made me less popular in some circles. Some people think I'm difficult now, too concerned with recognition, not a team player. Those people can think whatever they want. I'm not losing another company because I was too polite to defend what's mine. My former partner reached out once after everything settled, wanted to meet for coffee and clear the air. I declined. There's nothing to clear. They tried to steal my company using legal manipulation and board politics. They failed. That's the whole story. We don't need to have some reconciliation conversation where they explain how they were under stress or feeling undervalued or whatever justification they've constructed. I know what they did. They know what they did. Everything else is just noise. The company's doing better than ever now. Turns out when you remove the person who was playing politics instead of working, productivity actually increases. Revenue's up, employee morale is better. Clients have commented that communication and decision-making feel more streamlined. Investors are happy with the direction and growth trajectory. Sometimes the best business decision is removing the person who thinks running a company means controlling it, rather than building it. Some people wait for you to stay silent. Others rewrite history entirely, hoping you won't fight back. After our breakup, my ex started telling people a version of our relationship that I didn't even recognize. According to them, I'd been emotionally abusive, controlling, and unfaithful throughout our entire time together. They painted this picture of me as this manipulative monster who'd gaslit them for years, isolated them from friends, and cheated constantly. None of it was true, but the thing about lies is they spread faster than truth, especially when they're dramatic and fit a neat villain narrative. Mutual friends started ghosting me. People I'd known for years, people who'd been at our apartment for game nights and dinners, just stopped responding to my messages. I'd see them active on social media, posting and commenting, clearly not too busy to engage, just too busy to engage with me. A few people unfollowed me without explanation. One friend, someone I'd considered close, sent me a message saying they were disappointed in me and needed space to process what they'd learned. When I asked what they'd learned, they wouldn't elaborate, just said my ex had confided in them and they believed them. Then I lost a freelance client, a good one, someone who'd been sending me steady work for over a year. They sent a brief email saying they were going in a different direction and wouldn't be needing my services anymore. Professional, polite, but sudden. I found out later through a mutual connection that they'd heard rumors about me being abusive and didn't want to work with someone like that. The rumor had cost me actual income. This wasn't just social drama anymore. This was affecting my livelihood. The stories kept spreading. My ex had apparently told different versions to different people, but the core narrative was always the same. I was the bad guy. They were the victim. They'd finally escaped. I'd see vague posts on social media, things like finally free from toxic people, or so grateful for friends who helped me see the truth. They never tagged me, never named me directly, but everyone knew who they were talking about. The comments were always supportive, people saying how brave they were, how strong, how they deserved better. I was devastated. I didn't know how to fight back against something so pervasive. Defending yourself against accusations of abuse is almost impossible because anything you say sounds like exactly what an abuser would say. If I stayed silent, people assumed the accusations were true. If I spoke up, I looked defensive and guilty. I felt trapped, but that wasn't even the worst part. I started second-guessing myself. When enough people believe something about you, you start wondering if maybe they're right. Maybe I'd been controlling without realizing it. Maybe my memory of the relationship was skewed. Maybe I was the problem and I'd been too self-absorbed to see it. I went through months of our relationship in my head, analyzing every argument, every decision, every interaction, trying to find evidence that I was the monster they said I was. Then I remembered the therapy sessions. We'd gone to couples therapy for almost 6 months before we finally broke up. I'd kept notes from every session, partially because my therapist recommended it, partially because I have a habit of writing things down to process them. I pulled out those notes and started reading through them, session after session of our therapist, identifying problematic patterns in my ex's behavior: deflection, projection, refusal to take accountability. There were notes about my ex admitting to lying about where they'd been, admitting to maintaining inappropriate contact with someone they'd previously been involved with, admitting to deliberately starting arguments to avoid addressing real issues. I also had text messages, hundreds of them. I'm the kind of person who never deletes anything, and going through my phone, I found conversations I'd completely forgotten about. Messages where my ex admitted to cheating, messages where they apologized for making me feel crazy when I'd noticed inconsistencies in their stories, messages where they explicitly said they'd told their friends a twisted version of an argument to make me look bad because they were embarrassed about their own behavior. I had proof, documented, time-stamped, undeniable proof that the narrative they were spreading was fabricated. But I didn't want to use it. I didn't want to be the person who aired dirty laundry publicly. I didn't want to turn our breakup into a spectacle. So I reached out privately to a few close friends, people I knew had heard my ex's version. I showed them some of the therapy notes, some of the messages, just enough to give context. They were shocked. They asked why I hadn't said anything sooner. I told them I didn't want to fight dirty, that I'd hoped the truth would eventually come out on its own, that I didn't think I needed to defend myself against lies. One friend got angry on my behalf, said I'd been letting myself get destroyed for no reason. Another said they felt stupid for believing my ex without questioning it. They all said they'd try to set the record straight with other people, but I could tell they felt awkward about it. Retracting gossip is never as satisfying as spreading it. I thought that would be enough. I thought maybe the private corrections would slowly undo the damage, but then my ex posted a public Twitter thread, a full narrative, multiple tweets, detailing our relationship from their perspective, how they'd been trapped, how they'd finally found the courage to leave, how they were still healing from the trauma I'd inflicted. They used phrases like emotional terrorism and systematic gaslighting. They talked about how I'd threatened them, controlled their finances, isolated them from support systems. None of it was true, but it was compelling. The thread got hundreds of likes, dozens of supportive replies. People were calling me a monster without ever saying my name. This is where patience finally snapped. I tried to take the high road. I tried to let it go. I tried to correct things quietly. But watching my ex publicly destroy my reputation with lies while positioning themselves as a brave survivor, I was done. I wrote a statement. Calm, factual, no personal attacks. I explained that we'd been in therapy for months before the breakup, and that the therapist had identified concerning patterns in my ex's behavior, not mine. I included redacted screenshots of therapy session summaries, with my ex's identifying information removed, but the content visible. I included time-stamped text messages where they'd admitted to the things they were now accusing me of. I didn't post everything. I didn't include the worst of it, the most humiliating confessions, the cruelest manipulations. I just posted enough to show that their public narrative was contradicted by documented evidence from when we were still together. I posted it and then I put my phone down and tried not to think about what would happen next. The response was immediate. People who'd believed my ex started questioning the story. The therapy notes especially seemed to shift things because they were clinical, objective, written by a neutral third party. It wasn't he said, she said anymore. It was here's what a licensed therapist observed and documented. The Twitter thread my ex had posted started getting quoted with comments like this: didn't age well, and imagine lying about abuse for sympathy. My ex deleted everything within hours. The Twitter thread, the vague social media posts, all of it disappeared. They went completely silent. No explanation, no apology, no acknowledgement. Just scrubbed their accounts and stopped posting. Some of their friends tried to defend them, said I was weaponizing therapy notes, that I was violating their privacy. But most people saw it for what it was. Someone had been caught in a lie and was trying to hide the evidence. I didn't gloat. I didn't make victory posts. I didn't rub it in anyone's face. I just wanted the truth out there. I wanted people to know that I wasn't the person my ex had described, that our relationship had problems, sure, but I wasn't an abuser. I wasn't a monster. I was just someone who'd been in a dysfunctional relationship with someone who'd rather rewrite history than take responsibility. Some friendships were repaired. People reached out to apologize, said they should have asked for my side before cutting me off. I appreciated the apologies, but I also knew those friendships would never be quite the same. There's something that breaks when someone believes the worst about you without question. A few people never reached back out, either because they still believe my ex or because they were too embarrassed to admit they'd been wrong. The freelance client didn't come back. Once you lose professional relationships over personal drama, they rarely recover. But I found other clients, rebuilt that income stream. The damage wasn't permanent, just painful. Looking back, I wish I'd released the proof sooner. Not because I wanted to hurt my ex, but because watching lies spread while staying silent almost destroyed me. There's this idea that taking the high road means never defending yourself, never correcting false narratives, just enduring with quiet dignity. But sometimes the high road is just self-destruction with better PR. Sometimes you have to fight back, not because you want to win, but because you deserve to have your truth heard. My ex never apologized, never acknowledged what they'd done. I don't expect them to. People who rewrite history that dramatically aren't capable of honest reflection. But I don't need their apology. I just needed people to know the truth. And now they do. Truth is powerful, but sometimes it arrives in the form of one accidental email that changes everything. I was sitting at my desk on a random Tuesday afternoon when an email notification popped up. Standard work stuff, or so I thought. I opened it and saw it was a forward from a colleague I barely interacted with, someone from a different team who I'd maybe spoken to 3 times in the past year. The subject line was timeline and talking points. I almost deleted it thinking it was sent to me by mistake, but something made me open it anyway. The first thing I noticed was the long chain of previous messages. This wasn't a fresh email. It was part of an ongoing conversation that had been happening for weeks, maybe months. I started reading from the bottom up, trying to understand what I was looking at. Then I saw my name. And then I saw it again, and again. My stomach dropped as I realized what I was reading. This was a coordinated plan to get me fired. Not just complaining about me, not just venting, an actual structured plan with timelines, assigned roles, and specific strategies. There were 5 people involved, 4 co-workers and 1 manager. They'd been collecting evidence against me for months, except it wasn't real evidence. It was manufactured. Out of context Slack messages where I'd given direct feedback that they were framing as aggressive attacks, emails where I'd pushed back on bad ideas that they were spinning as me being difficult and uncooperative, normal workplace interactions that they were deliberately misrepresenting to paint me as someone creating a toxic work environment. The email thread had everything: dates for when they planned to report me to HR, a strategy to submit complaints all at once so it would seem like multiple people independently had issues with me, making it look more credible than if it was just one person. Assigned talking points for each person so their stories would align without seeming rehearsed. They'd even discussed which HR representative to target, because one was supposedly more sympathetic to workplace culture complaints. One message from the manager said they needed to be careful to make it seem organic, that if HR suspected coordination, it would backfire. Another co-worker responded saying they had screenshots of me giving critical feedback in a team meeting, and that they could frame it as me publicly humiliating people. I remembered that meeting. I'd pointed out flaws in a project proposal that could have cost us a client. It was my job to catch those things, but they were going to turn it into evidence of me being a bully. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't office politics. This was an actual conspiracy to destroy my career. These people had spent months building a case against me based on lies and twisted context, and they were days away from executing their plan. If that email hadn't been accidentally sent to me, I would have walked into an HR ambush with no idea what was coming, no way to defend myself against a coordinated narrative from multiple people. I read through the entire thread 3 times, making sure I understood the scope. They had a shared document with all their collected evidence. They'd been meeting in person to avoid leaving digital trails. This email chain was just the logistical coordination. They'd even practiced their statements, making sure everyone's version of events complemented the others without being identical. It was sophisticated, thought out. calculated. The colleague who'd accidentally forwarded it to me had meant to send it only to the group, but they'd hit reply all on a previous company-wide announcement that I'd been copied on, and I'd gotten pulled into the thread. A complete accident. One wrong button click, and their entire plan was exposed. I immediately forwarded the whole chain to HR. Then I forwarded it to my direct supervisor. Then I forwarded it to the VP of our division. I attached a brief message saying I'd received this by accident and needed immediate guidance on how to proceed. Then I sat at my desk trying not to have a panic attack while I waited for someone to respond. HR called me within 20 minutes. They asked me to come to their office immediately and to bring my laptop. I walked down there feeling like I was moving through water, everything slow and surreal. The HR director and another representative were waiting. They had the email pulled up on their screen. They asked me to walk them through my relationship with each person involved. Any previous conflicts, anything that might explain why this was happening. I told them the truth. I barely knew most of these people. We worked in adjacent teams but didn't interact daily. The manager wasn't even my direct supervisor. They oversaw a different department. I'd given feedback in cross-functional meetings, pushed back on ideas I thought were flawed, done my job the way I was supposed to. But I'd never had a personal conflict with any of them. Never been written up, never had a complaint filed against me, never even had an uncomfortable conversation with HR before this moment. The HR director said they were launching an immediate investigation. They asked me not to contact anyone involved, not to discuss this with other coworkers, just to continue working normally while they looked into it. I asked how I was supposed to work normally knowing there were people actively trying to get me fired. They didn't have a good answer for that. The investigation took 2 weeks. Every person in that email thread was interviewed. HR pulled Slack messages, emails, meeting recordings, everything the group had claimed as evidence. They interviewed people outside the conspiracy too, asking about my behavior, my professionalism, whether I'd ever made anyone uncomfortable. They built a complete picture of what had actually been happening versus what was being alleged. Then came the breaking point. The investigation concluded that the entire thing was fabricated. Every piece of evidence the group had collected was either taken completely out of context or misrepresented to fit a narrative that didn't exist. The timeline document they created showed premeditation. The assigned talking points proved coordination. HR classified it as conspiracy and harassment, workplace bullying, an attempt to weaponize company policies to eliminate someone they just didn't like. 3 of the co-workers were terminated immediately, just walked out of the building that day. The 4th was given a final written warning and transferred to a different division. The manager was demoted and stripped of their direct reports. HR sent a company-wide email about the importance of good faith reporting and the serious consequences of making false claims. They didn't name anyone specifically, but word spread fast. People knew. The VP called me into his office. He apologized on behalf of the company, said this should never have happened, that they took workplace integrity seriously. Then he offered me a transfer to a different department, one completely separate from anyone involved. Better role, better team, and a 15% raise. He said it was their way of making things right, of showing they valued me and wanted me to stay. I took the transfer. New desk, new projects, new faces. Everyone was professional and welcoming. But I couldn't shake the paranoia. I started screenshotting every conversation, recording meetings when legally allowed, keeping meticulous documentation of every interaction. I knew I was being excessive, that lightning doesn't strike twice, but I couldn't stop. Those people had spent months building a case against me in secret. Who's to say someone else wasn't doing the same thing right now? I still work at the same company. The new role is good, the team is solid, and I haven't had any issues. But I'm different now. I second guess every piece of feedback I give, wondering if someone's going to screenshot it and use it against me later. I'm careful about how I word things in Slack, in emails, in meetings. I've become hyper-aware of how anything I say could be twisted if someone wanted to. The colleague who accidentally sent me that email reached out months later. They said they felt terrible, that they'd been pressured into joining the group and didn't realize how far it would go. They claimed they were planning to back out before the HR reports were filed. I didn't respond. Whether they were genuinely remorseful or just trying to ease their own guilt didn't matter. They'd participated. They'd helped build the case. The only reason I survived was because they made a mistake. I think about that a lot. How close I came to losing everything because of one forwarded email that was never supposed to reach me. If they'd been more careful, if that colleague hadn't hit reply all, I would have walked into an HR meeting facing 5 coordinated complaints with no warning. My career would have been over. Even if I'd eventually proven my innocence, the damage would have been done. I'd be the person who got investigated for creating a toxic workplace. That stain doesn't wash off. The 3 people who were fired tried to fight it, claimed wrongful termination, that they'd been exercising their right to report workplace concerns. The company's lawyers shut that down fast. The email thread was evidence of conspiracy. The documented coordination proved it wasn't good faith reporting. Their cases went nowhere. I ran into one of them at a coffee shop about a year later. They saw me and immediately turned around and left. Didn't say a word, just walked out. Part of me wanted to follow them, to ask why. What had I done to make them hate me enough to spend months trying to destroy me? But I already knew the answer. Sometimes people don't need a reason. Sometimes you're just in the way, or they don't like your face, or you got credit for something they wanted. The why doesn't really matter when the what is that extreme. I still have that email thread saved in 3 different places. Printed copies in a folder at home, digital backups on personal drives. I know I should delete it, move on, let it go. But I can't. It's proof that I'm not crazy, that it really happened, that I was right to be suspicious and careful and paranoid. It's my insurance policy against anyone ever telling me I'm overreacting when I document everything. The worst part isn't that it happened. The worst part is knowing it could happen again. That right now, somewhere, someone might be building a case against me, and I won't know until it's too late. That's what they took from me. Not my job, not my reputation, but my ability to trust that people aren't actively working against me in secret. At least I had evidence. But imagine being asked to help someone, only to end up in court. My childhood best friend called me excited about finally chasing their dream. They were starting a business, had the whole plan mapped out, found the perfect location. But there was one problem. Their credit wasn't quite good enough to qualify for the commercial lease on their own. They needed a co-signer just for the application process. They promised it was temporary, that once the business was established and their credit improved in 6 months, they'd refinance and get me off the lease. It was purely a formality to get things started. I trusted them completely. We'd known each other since we were kids. They'd been at every major moment of my life. I'd been at theirs. When they asked for help, I didn't even think twice. I met them at the leasing office, signed the paperwork, and felt good about supporting someone I cared about in pursuing their goals. The lease was for a small retail space, nothing extravagant. I figured even if something went wrong, how bad could it be? 6 months came and went. I'd check in occasionally, ask how the business was going. They always said great, things were building, just needed a little more time before refinancing the lease. I didn't push, I trusted them. A year went by. I honestly forgot I was even on that lease. Then I came home one afternoon to find an official-looking envelope taped to my door. Legal papers. I'd been served with a lawsuit. I opened it standing right there in my hallway, and my stomach dropped. The landlord was suing for $45,000. Back rent, property damages, lease-breaking fees, legal costs, the whole catastrophic package. According to the filing, rent hadn't been paid in 7 months. The property had been abandoned with significant damage, and as a co-signer on the lease, I was equally liable for the full amount. I called my friend immediately. The number was disconnected. I checked their social media. Every account was deleted or deactivated. I drove to the business location. The space was completely empty, windows papered over, a notice from the landlord on the door about abandoned property. I tried calling their family. Nobody had heard from them in months. They'd vanished. I couldn't believe it. This was someone I'd known my entire life, someone I'd trusted without question, and they just disappeared the second things went bad, leaving me holding a $45,000 bag. I spent that whole night in a panic, going through my finances, trying to figure out how I was supposed to come up with that kind of money. I didn't have it, not even close. This lawsuit could destroy me financially for years. I hired a lawyer the next day. Cost me $2,000 I didn't really have just for the retainer, but I didn't know what else to do. The lawyer reviewed everything and delivered news that somehow made it worse. He said my friend had been running a scam. They'd never actually operated a legitimate business in that space. They'd been illegally subleasing it to various short-term renters, pocketing the money and never paying the actual landlord. They'd used the commercial lease I'd co-signed to establish credibility, then turned it into a cash operation while the landlord thought everything was fine. Here's where it gets absurd. My friend had apparently done this before. My lawyer found records of similar situations in 2 other cities. Different victims, same playbook. Get someone to co-sign, run the scam for as long as possible, disappear before consequences arrive. I wasn't even the first person they'd done this to. I was just the latest in a pattern. The person I'd known since childhood, the one I'd trusted completely, was apparently a serial con artist who specialized in exploiting personal relationships. I felt like the world's biggest idiot. Every interaction we'd had over the past year replayed in my mind with new context. All those vague updates about the business doing great. The excuses about why I couldn't visit the location yet. The delays on refinancing the lease. It had all been lies, carefully constructed to keep me complacent while they ran their operation. The lawyer said fighting the lawsuit would be difficult. I had signed the lease. My name was legally attached to the debt. The landlord didn't care that I'd been deceived. They just wanted their money, and I was the only person they could actually find. My friend's disappearing act meant I was the sole target. But we could try to argue fraud, demonstrate I'd been a victim too, and maybe negotiate a settlement. We went to court. I brought every text message, every email, every piece of evidence showing I'd been promised this was temporary, and that I'd had no knowledge of what was actually happening with the property. I showed the timeline of how my friend had disappeared the moment trouble started. I presented character statements, my own financial records, showing I couldn't possibly have been involved in a scheme to pocket sublease money since I'd never seen a dime. The judge listened but ultimately said that while I'd clearly been taken advantage of, I'd still signed a legal document making me responsible. Ignorance wasn't a legal defense. My friend's fraud didn't erase my obligation. But the judge also acknowledged that $45,000 was excessive given the circumstances and that I was clearly not the primary bad actor here. We settled. $15,000. Still a massive hit, but better than the original amount. I had to take out a loan to cover it, wiping out what little savings I had and saddling me with debt I'd be paying off for years. The landlord agreed to the reduced amount just to close the case and avoid further legal costs. They knew chasing my friend was pointless. My credit score dropped almost 200 points. The lawsuit showed up on my record. I got denied for an apartment lease 6 months later because of it. Had to explain in job interviews why a background check showed I'd been sued. The financial damage was one thing, but the ripple effects touched everything. Every aspect of my life was affected by those signatures I'd put on a lease over a year ago. I never heard from my friend again. Not an apology, not an explanation, nothing. They'd moved on to whatever their next scheme was, leaving behind a trail of people they'd used and discarded. I tried to track them down at first, thinking maybe I could get some of the money back, but my lawyer said it wasn't worth it. People like that don't have assets you can go after. They're judgment-proof by design. I'd just be throwing more money into a hole. The worst part was how stupid I felt. Everyone kept asking why I'd co-signed without doing more research, without getting legal advice first, without protecting myself. And they were right. I should have done all those things. But I'd trusted someone I'd known for decades. I didn't think I needed to treat them like a potential threat. That trust had cost me $15,000, years of damaged credit, and the worst lesson I'd ever learned about human nature. I looked into whether I could press criminal charges. My lawyer said technically yes, but finding them would be the hard part, and even if they were found and convicted, I still wouldn't get my money back. Criminal courts don't award financial restitution the way civil courts do. I'd be spending more money on lawyers for the satisfaction of maybe seeing them face consequences. I couldn't afford it, emotionally or financially. I've since learned that co-signing horror stories are everywhere. Entire online communities of people who've been destroyed financially by helping friends or family. Parents who co-signed student loans and ended up liable when their kids couldn't pay. Siblings who helped each other get car loans and got stuck with repossession damage. The stories are all variations of the same theme. Trust someone, sign paperwork, get destroyed when things go wrong. I will never co-sign anything for anyone ever again. I don't care if it's family. I don't care if it's my closest friend. I don't care if they swear it's temporary or just a formality. The answer is no. I learned that lesson at a $15,000 price tag, and I'm not learning it twice. People ask sometimes if I'd forgive my friend if they showed up and apologized. Honest answer? I don't know. Part of me wants to believe there was some external circumstance that forced their hand, that they're not just a predator who targeted people who cared about them, but the evidence doesn't support that version. The pattern was too clear, the disappearance too calculated. They knew exactly what they were doing and who they were doing it to. My credit has slowly recovered. The debt is almost paid off. But every time I see anything about co-signing, every time someone asks me to be a reference or help with paperwork, I get this pit in my stomach. The trust I used to extend freely is just gone. Maybe that's sad. Maybe it means they won by making me cynical. But it also means I'll never be in this position again. Co-signing can ruin you financially, but some people use therapy language to destroy you emotionally. My partner started going to therapy, and I was genuinely happy about it. They'd been dealing with some difficult family stuff, and I thought having professional support would be good for them. For the first few weeks, they seemed lighter, more reflective. They'd come home from sessions talking about insights they'd had, patterns they were recognizing. I was proud of them for doing the work. I thought this was going to be a positive turning point for both of us. Then something shifted. They started using therapy language in our conversations, which at first seemed healthy. They'd talk about boundaries and emotional needs and trauma responses, but slowly I noticed these terms were only ever applied in one direction. Every disagreement we had became about me invalidating their feelings. If I tried to explain my perspective, I was being defensive. If I asked them to consider my side of things, I was centering myself in their pain. It felt like I couldn't say anything without being accused of causing harm. Setting boundaries became controlling behavior. I asked them to let me know if they'd be home late so I wouldn't worry, and suddenly I was being possessive and trying to monitor their movements. I mentioned that I needed some alone time after a stressful work week, and they said I was emotionally withdrawing and punishing them. Normal relationship requests were reframed as red flags of my problematic behavior. Asking questions became trauma response triggering. If I asked about their day, I was interrogating them. If I wondered why plans had changed, I was being suspicious and mistrustful. They'd tell me that my need for information was rooted in control issues and that I needed to learn to sit with uncertainty. I started walking on eggshells, afraid that any normal conversation would turn into an accusation that I was damaging their mental health. I started doubting everything. Was I really that controlling? Was I invalidating without realizing it? Was my anxiety about the relationship actually me being manipulative? I'd lie awake at night replaying conversations, trying to figure out where I'd gone wrong. My partner seemed so confident in their assessments, so fluent in psychological terminology. They'd cite concepts from therapy, reference things their therapist had apparently said, use language that sounded official and clinical. How could I argue with that? They were in therapy, working on themselves, learning about healthy relationships. Maybe I was the problem and just too defensive to see it. After a particularly brutal argument where they told me my communication style was toxic and emotionally unsafe, I suggested couples therapy. I thought if we could talk through these issues with a professional, maybe we could find a way forward. Maybe a therapist could help me understand what I was doing wrong and how to be better. Their response shocked me. They said absolutely not. They said I needed to do my own work first before they'd consider couples therapy. That I was trying to use their therapeutic process against them. That I was so far from self-awareness that joint sessions would just be me manipulating a therapist into taking my side. That's when something clicked. If I was really the problem, why wouldn't they want professional help addressing it? If our relationship issues were primarily caused by my behavior, wouldn't a couples therapist be able to identify that? Their refusal didn't make sense unless they knew that an objective third party might see things differently than they were claiming. I started my own therapy. I went in fully prepared to work on my controlling tendencies, my invalidating communication, all the things my partner had identified as problems. I told my therapist everything. I laid out examples of conflicts we'd had, explained how my partner had framed them, asked for honest feedback about my behavior. I expected to be told I needed to make major changes. Instead, my therapist got very quiet and asked if I'd ever heard the term weaponized therapy speak. She gently walked me through what she was observing. My partner wasn't using therapy language to communicate or heal. They were using it to avoid accountability and shut down any pushback. Every psychological term was being deployed strategically to make me the villain in every scenario, regardless of what had actually happened. She pointed out that healthy use of therapy concepts involves self-reflection and mutual understanding. What my partner was doing was projection and manipulation dressed up in clinical language. I felt like I'd been living underwater and someone had just pulled me to the surface. Everything suddenly made horrible sense. The reason I couldn't win any argument wasn't because I was wrong. It was because the game was rigged. My partner had found a foolproof system, frame everything in therapy terms, accuse me of psychological harm, and I'd be too busy defending myself to notice they never took responsibility for anything. But I needed proof, not just for them, for myself. I needed to hear it objectively, to know I wasn't imagining the manipulation. I started recording our conversations. It's legal in my state to record with single-party consent, so I didn't need their permission. I wasn't trying to trap them. I just wanted to be able to listen back and hear whether what I remembered matched what actually happened. The recordings were chilling. Listening to them without the emotional overwhelm of being in the moment, I could hear it so clearly. My partner would say something hurtful, I'd express that it hurt, and they'd immediately flip it to how my reaction was invalidating their right to express themselves. I'd try to set a boundary, they'd reframe it as me being controlling. I'd ask for basic communication, they'd call it surveillance. And through it all, this calm, therapeutic tone, like they were the rational one dealing with my dysfunction. One recording was particularly bad. We'd been talking about household responsibilities, and I'd mentioned that I felt like I was doing most of the cleaning. A completely normal relationship conversation. My partner responded by saying that my need to quantify contributions was a sign of transactional thinking and emotional immaturity, that me bringing up the cleaning was actually me trying to manipulate them into feeling guilty, that I was weaponizing household labor to avoid addressing my deeper intimacy issues. I listened to myself in that recording, trying to defend basic fairness and being told I was psychologically harmful for even bringing it up. Things went from bad to unhinged when I played one of the recordings for them. Not to ambush them, but because I genuinely wanted them to hear what I was hearing. I chose one of the clearer examples and played it while we were both calm. I said, "This isn't therapy language. This is abuse. You're using psychological concepts to gaslight me into thinking normal relationship expectations are character flaws." They stared at the phone, playing back their own voice. I watched their face go through several emotions: shock, denial, anger, and then something that looked like shame. They tried to argue at first, said I'd violated their trust by recording, that this was exactly the kind of controlling behavior they'd been talking about. But the recording was still playing, their own words proving my point in real time. Then they broke down. Not the defensive breakdown I'd gotten used to, but something more real. They admitted they'd been using tactics they'd learned from relationship strategy forums online, forums where people trade manipulation techniques disguised as self-help advice. They said they'd started reading them after we'd had a few arguments early in the relationship, looking for ways to win conflicts. The therapy language wasn't coming from their actual therapy sessions. It was coming from internet strangers teaching them how to weaponize psychology against their partners. They said they'd convinced themselves it was okay because the forums framed it as protecting yourself from toxic partners and setting healthy boundaries. But somewhere along the way, they'd turned me into a villain who needed to be managed and controlled, and they used therapeutic language as the weapon. They cried and said they didn't know how it had gotten so twisted, that they knew they'd been hurting me, but they couldn't stop. I asked if their therapist knew they were doing this. They said no. They'd been going to therapy and talking about our relationship, but only giving the version where I was the problem and they were the victim setting boundaries. Their therapist had been working with false information this entire time, probably giving advice based on a completely fabricated narrative. I told them I was leaving. Not in anger, just in exhausted clarity. I couldn't stay with someone who'd spent months systematically destroying my sense of reality, who'd taken the language of healing and turned it into a tool of harm, who'd made me doubt my own sanity while playing the role of the self-aware partner working on themselves. They begged me to stay, said they'd stop, that they'd tell their therapist the truth, that we could start over. But I was done. You don't come back from that level of manipulation. You don't rebuild trust with someone who spent months gaslighting you with psychology textbook terminology. They'd made me feel crazy while acting like they were the healthy one. That's not something you forgive and forget. I moved out within 2 weeks. My own therapy helped me process what had happened, helped me understand that being manipulated by someone using clinical language doesn't make you weak or stupid. It makes you someone who trusted their partner and got exploited for it. My therapist helped me see that the fact I'd questioned myself so thoroughly actually showed self-awareness, not dysfunction. My partner had weaponized my willingness to self-reflect. The aftermath was strange. Mutual friends got very confused versions of our breakup. My ex told some people I'd been recording them without consent, framing it as a violation, left out the part about why I'd felt the need to document reality. Some people believed them. I didn't fight it. I was too tired to care about managing narratives. What I learned from all of this is that therapy language in the wrong hands is incredibly dangerous. Terms like gaslighting, narcissism, boundaries, trauma response, they're important concepts, but they can be twisted into weapons by people who want to avoid accountability. Real therapeutic growth involves humility and self-examination. What my ex was doing was the opposite. They were using psychology as a shield and a sword, never for actual healing. I'm in a healthier relationship now, with someone who doesn't need to cite therapy concepts to communicate, who can say, "I'm sorry I hurt you," without launching into a lecture about how my emotional response is problematic, who takes responsibility without reframing it as me being controlling for expecting basic accountability. It's wild how simple healthy communication is when nobody's weaponizing psychology. My ex reached out once, months later, saying their therapist had helped them see what they'd done and they wanted to apologize. I read the message and didn't respond. Some apologies come too late, and some damage doesn't need closure. I hope they actually did the work. I hope they stopped using those forums and started being honest in therapy. But that's not my responsibility anymore. Therapy saved me, just not the way my ex thought it would. They assumed therapy language would let them control me forever. Instead, actual therapy helped me see through it and gave me the strength to leave. Sweet dreams, everyone. And remember, trust your gut, document everything, and never let anyone gaslight you into doubting your reality. These stories remind us that betrayal comes in many forms, but so does resilience. If you made it this far, you're part of the community now. Drop a comment about which story hit hardest, subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the next one. Sleep well and stay sharp out there.